It's a very ironic and peculiar situation, because socialism and communism is overwhelmingly all around us worldwide. These socialists and Marxist utopians don't want to live in the places across the world which base their principles and beliefs of that of their own. On the contrary, they would rather have their utopic society instated in a free, prosperous civilization where the reasons of its greatness is because it was literally built up off capitalism and wealth creation.
To understand the radical left, you must first examine and study the ideologies and know their ideology better than they understand it. We must focus on where these ideas have emerged from and the tools that they plan to use to implement their ideology upon the masses. In this chapter, we are going to focus on the ideologies of the left, along with defining terms associated with the radical left. Dialectics. A rationale for dialectical materialism based on change through the conflict of opposing forces.
The word dialectic comes from is the Greek word dialektike, which was used specifically to describe the Socratic method, where they would come up with some kind of an abstract idea, you know, whatever they're thinking of, and they would come up with objections to it to try and to falsify it or to see if it could be falsified. And this is where they get the term Hegelian dialectic, where they kind of take this concept, but they make it a little bit different, and they basically use two opposing forces and in relation to each other, and they supposedly are supposed to bring out a solution.
Materialism, the theory that matter is the basic reality of the universe. Hence, everything is material or can be shown to derive ultimately from matter.
Dialectical materialism, the Marxist theory based on Hegelian dialectic, affirming that matter exists independently of thought and that it develops by successive oppositions or negations.
It just seems really silly to me that Marx and Engels would try to make moral claims as materialists. If we were the chance byproducts of a random natural process with a bunch of other accidents from random chemical processes running around that make up our environment, I just don't see how, you know, that follows that we need all kinds of all these rights and everything that follow from that. It's fallacious. It doesn't make any sense. Materialism just has no grounds making ethical claims, because if we are indeed the byproduct of a long chemical process that's kind of like Hegelian dialectics but applied to nature, then I just don't see how that entitles us to, you know, all these rights. You know, are we gonna go around giving health care to, you know, to all like chickens and like cows and stuff like that too? Because I mean, according to the basic theory of materialism, we're like distant cousins to these creatures. So why don't we let them join in on this too? Why does the boundary stop for human beings? It just doesn't make any sense. If we're just only here because we're lucky and not because, you know, we have some right, then it just doesn't follow that Marx and Engels should be making these types of ethical claims, because it just does not follow from that materialistic worldview. A really easy way of exposing how logically fallacious the Hegelian dialectic system really is to actually take a very familiar example, and a very appropriate one too, because it's going to be examining the government. And think of the left-right political spectrum, the way the liberal sees it and the way a conservative sees it. On one hand, you have the liberal seeing it as the far left being totally egalitarian, and as opposed to the far right, which would be totally like a hierarchy type thing, like fascism. And then you have a conservative who looks at the government as if the far right is zero government and the far left is like a total nanny state, like total control grid type state. But if you look at communism and fascism and plug them into both of those formulas, you get them both on opposite side of the political spectrum each time. You have you'll have them either both on the far left, or well, fascism will be on the right on one and communism on the left. It just doesn't make sense why you would take two opposing attributes and just say that this is how I'm going to compare something, when there are many, many other things you could compare that are totally relevant, as you can see by that example.
Hegelian dialectics derives from the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel's theory of dialectics was made up of three attributes, which are abstract, negative, and concrete. Later on, Heinrich Moritz Charlevoix created a more evolved Hegelian dialectic formula using the thesis-antithesis model. Dialectical materialism is the theory where Karl Marx tried to affirm that matter exists independently of thought and that it only develops by successive oppositions or negations. This concept entails that everything we do and every thought we have is merely a chemical reaction that is taking place inside of our body and brain. Therefore, there cannot be any form of free will, nor could there be any objective moral truths, or any truths for that matter. In fact, the theory of Marxist dialectics could only philosophically make sense from a materialistic worldview. So, when we apply this theory to Marxist thought, Marxist Hegelian dialectics that is, it takes two opposing ideas and believes that they will create a desirable solution to the problem. But we could philosophically apply this to virtually everything, and it wouldn't make any sense because two opposing ideas does not necessarily equate a solution nor a desirable one at that. What happens if one is completely right and the opposite is completely wrong? Or what happens if they are both wrong? It just wouldn't follow a proper objective solution. For instance, you could apply this to morality. Two wrongs do not make a right. Furthermore, it would be completely presuppositional to interpret the synthesis as a predictable conclusion, because there are just way too many variables and factors to be considered, and the future cannot be surely predetermined by opposing forces.
In more modern times, the thesis-antithesis-synthesis formula has been more commonly referred to as problem, reaction, solution. And some examples of that would be a coup d'etat or a false flag attack. This problem-reaction solution is more prevalent among the professional protest and activist movement here in Canada, where the foreign non-governmental organizations are organizing and funding the civil unrest, deindustrialization, and the collapse of our economy, so that a communistic coup d'etat can occur, similar to what has been recently taken place in the Ukraine.
Marx and Engels divided history into 5 periods. 1. Primitive communism, or gens, hunter-gatherer societies. 2. Slavery. 3. Feudalism. 4. Capitalism. And finally, 5. Communism.
I don't see where you'd find that order of events anywhere other than this type of philosophy. It just doesn't make any sense why they would say we came from primitive communism, then somehow went to slavery, and then feudalism, and then capitalism, and then communism. It just does not make any sense because, I don't know, they just don't necessarily follow from each other.
Naturalism, a mode of thought, religious, moral, or philosophical, glorifying nature and excluding supernatural and spiritual elements.
When you do what the environmentalists do and hold the rest of nature as equivalent to humanity, it leads to some problems. First of all, if we want to eat something or, keep warm, we need to, take life of an animal or cut down a tree and make a fire. So if we are equal to these trees, what gives us the right to cut them down and burn them or, hunt for food or anything like that? If they are supposedly held to the same standard that we are. And this type of thinking leads to a devaluation of human life and is often why atheistic regimes are the most efficient killing machines ever to exist in human history. And here's an example of why that is.
Deep in the woods of North Carolina, an extremist eco group called Earth First bewails the violation of American nature.
I want to mourn the loss of all the old growth trees I've seen, and tell them that we love them and that we don't want them to die, that there are some people here who do care. So I want you to know that, trees, that we care.
Bring me to this cathedral. Bring me to those guys. Bring me to this rock that has the most incredible life. That makes me feel alive.
I've looked at clear cuts and burnt forest, and I've felt outraged, but I didn't scream and I didn't cry. And I need to.
There are a few important terms in Marxist dialect that most people who aren't familiar with Marxism would not understand. So we shall go over 3 key terms that you should know and understand. Bourgeoisie, the social class between the lower and upper classes. Bourgeois, according to Marxist thought, being of the property-owning class and exploitive of the working class. Conforming to the standards and conventions of the middle class. Belonging to the middle class. A capitalist who engages in industrial commercial enterprise. A member of the middle class. Proletariat. A social class comprising of those who do manual labor or work for wages. Marxism. The political, economic, and social system advocated by Marx and Engels, as well as their followers. Its philosophical bases are dialectical materialism and historical materialism. It sees capitalist society in terms of the exploitation of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie. It holds that communism, the political aspect of the system, will be achieved when the class struggle results in the overthrow of capitalism by the dictatorship of the proletariat, and when a classless society has emerged from the withering away of the state. Socialism, a political and economic theory of advocating collective ownership of the means of production and control of distribution. It is based on the belief that all, while contributing to the good of the community, are equally entitled to the care and protection which the community can provide. Communism, the ownership of property or means of production, distribution, and supply by the whole of a classless society, with wealth shared on the principle of to each according to his needs, each yielding fully according to his ability. The body of political and economic doctrines which sets forth the establishing of this as a revolutionary aim through the dictatorship of the proletariat. Differences between socialism and communism. Both communism and socialism systems are secular in nature, but in my opinion, the primary differences between communism and socialism is that usually in a socialist society, you still have the right to private ownership. But the problem is that the nature of socialism is that it always leads to communism. And behold the famous quote by Vladimir Lenin, "The goal of socialism is communism." Here are a few important doctrines taken from the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels advocated. Chapter 1. Bourgeois and Proletarians. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less veiled civil war, raging with existing society, up to the point where the war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat.
In Chapter 1 of the Communist Manifesto, it clearly advocates violence. It advocates for a violent overthrow. It's funny because Marx and Engels make all these moral claims, but how can they make these moral claims and then advocate violence? This is just hypocritical on every level.
Chapter 2. Proletarians and Communists. The distinguishing feature of communism is not that the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of communists may be summed up in one single sentence: abolition of private property.
In Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, it clearly advocates against private property and individuals being able to have businesses and producing their own means. Say you wanted to have your own business, you could not do this because this is against communist ideology.
Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. In Chapter 2, the goals of communism are cited as 1. Abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3. Abolition of all right of inheritance. 4. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of the credit in the hands of the state, by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. 8. Equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of population over the country. 10. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of the children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production.
Moving forward in Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx clearly advocates against the family and says that this is an infamous proposal of the communists. This is communist ideology. I love my family. I'm sure you love your family. And I'm sure a lot of communists love their family. But they don't understand that this is communist ideology that advocates against the family because they think it's oppressive, which it's not. It's immoral to try to abolish the family. Now, I'm against abolition of children's factory labor. 100% I'm against slavery in all its forms. But to sit here and try to say that individuals are the cause of slavery and that the state could never perpetrate slavery is ridiculous, because we can go throughout history and show that the state has coercively been enslaving people for as long as time has been recorded. Ironically enough, communist China is the biggest perpetrator of slavery, factory slavery for that matter. So their reasoning for this just is non sequitur.
Non sequitur.
Chapter 3. Critical utopian socialism and communism. But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in them, such as abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of the carrying on of industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system, the proclamation of social harmony, the conversions of functions of the state into a mere superintendence of production. All these proposals point solely to a disappearance of class antagonisms, which were, at the time, only just cropping up, and which, in these publications are recognized in their earliest, indistinct and undefined forms only. These proposals, therefore, are of a purely utopian character. They, therefore, violently oppose all political action on the part of the working class. Such action, according to them, can only result from the blind unbelief in the new gospel.
In Chapter 3 of the Communist Manifesto, it clearly advocates that they must attack every principle of existing society. So when you see the professional protest movement hijacking every movement and protest there is, you cannot be surprised that they are not trying to organize and dictate these movements, because this is their ideology. It also advocates for the abolition of differentiating between town and country. And don't look any further than the United Nations that are trying to perpetrate this goal right now. Funny enough, Karl Marx indicates that these proposals are all purely of utopian character. And again, it's advocating abolition of the family. It's advocating against private property. Now finally, the last part that I highlighted out of this chapter is where Karl Marx summarizes saying that all communists therefore violently oppose all political action on the part of the working class.
Chapter 4. Position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling class tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win.
Now finally, in Chapter 4, we see yet again that communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. So this is again where the professional protest movement comes in. It also says that the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. So you should not be surprised when communists are so forward about their goals and how they're going to achieve them, no matter how violent they are. They really do think that this is the right thing to do. This is part of their ideology. Again, it's advocating violence. It says the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. So this is a violent ideology.
Now that we have quickly gone through the more important points in the Communist Manifesto, we can determine that they are completely utopianistic in theory. Utopianism is principally that of far-right and far-left-wing perspectives of ideology. Although utopianism is commonly prevalent with left-wing radicals, there are often individuals, including libertarians and anarchists, that believe their ideology is the perfect system that will ultimately bring in a utopia. But in the real world, no system is perfect, and that even goes for my own personal convictions of my self-proclaimed and embraced ideologies. Marxism and early socialist philosophy is 100% theorized as a utopic economic and political solution to society and/or capitalism. Utopianism is completely conflicting with human nature and is absolutely a fallacy.
My name is Ryan Elson, and I just wanted to talk to you about the communist infiltration that's occurring in Canada. Now, a lot of people believe that society has reached a point where we can better integrate jurisdictions and national governments to the point where we can just have a global government. That's been an ages-long quest, even predating the Roman Empire.
where they had the goal of like world unification, and same thing with Germany. They wanted to control like basically global domination and control. And I'm finding that there's a similar agenda, and it's tied in with communism, as like communism has been rolled out in smaller scales on the national scale, and a lot of people feel that that's the only possible system that the world can transition into, is one where everybody is interdependent and sharing stuff together. And I mean, I'm not a rich person. I really don't have terribly much to share with people, and just the thought of these people coming in and taking what little I have left for myself, and like just invading my space and using my space as their own and stuff, I find it kind of offensive, you know. The way that I first clued into them was with Occupy, when we went out and started attending their events and stuff. The very first event, they were trying to control the conversation, basically have the crowd draw the conclusions that they pre-chose, and if they didn't get the answers that they wanted from the crowd, they would just keep asking the question over and over and over again until they got the answer that they wanted. So I mean, that was the first sign that I ran into that there's something not right about these people. And like as I started to dig into them, I discovered that they were tied into like other major events in Canada, such as the 2010 Vancouver Olympics, such as the G20, where a lot of the like similar mindset individuals who are organized, the collective, as they like to be called, they were at the forefront of those events too. And so I started to begin to piece things together, where like the people that I was seeing out on the street, the facilitators who basically manage the structural operations of these revolutions, and that's basically what it is a structured revolutionary model, similar to what Otpor ran during the Bulgarian Revolution, right? And there's been many similar revolutions since, especially in Europe, in European countries, and it's basically the same kind of mechanism that's being ran here in Canada, which is kind of unbelievable. I mean, at first I didn't believe it, right? I knew that that's how things worked in other countries, but I mean, here in Canada, where like we all got to grow up with like democracy, like real democracy and freedom, that I mean we've been watching slowly get stripped away. It's almost like society had engineered itself. It knew that it was going to come to a point where this system that we're living under was going to reach a dead end because of technology, and it knew that it had to rebirth itself somehow. And it seems like the way that it wants to progress now is into a global communist new world order, which, I mean, if I had to vote, I would vote no. Hell no. I don't want to live under those kind of rules. But basically what they've done is they've taken the old and given it a new face with environmentalism. And like, I mean, it's just amazing. Since moving to Victoria, I found that there's like quite a startling amount of this agenda coming out of this town, and coming out of Vancouver especially. There's several hotbeds for it all across Canada. The major ones that I'd like to point out is Toronto and Montreal. Those are definite strategic targets for these people. Their primary focus is on tar sands, but it's not for the reasons that they say it is. It's not for saving the environment. The tar sands will continue to produce oil for Canadians. It's just a matter of how is that oil going to get moved around? Where's it going to get shipped to? Is it going to go down to the United States? Is it going to be sold at a discount, or is it going to be shipped within a competitive marketplace where there's either a pipeline going east or a pipeline going west, and there's other bidders at the table for our resources? So, I mean, one way or another, it looks like our resources are going to be consumed by other people around like the world.
First of all, if we're going to talk about collectivism and capitalism, we must first bring up the definition of collectivism, capitalism, cronyism, crony capitalism, and corporatism. Collectivism, a vague term applied to socialism and sometimes communism, referring to the belief that state action is desirable in matters often left in the hands of private individuals, or to the more definite proposition that the state should own all land and all means of production, distribution, and exchange. Capitalism, an economic system in which the means of production, distribution, and exchange are privately owned and operated for private profit. Cronyism, favoritism towards friends in business or government, as by appointing them to positions without regard for their qualifications. Crony capitalism, an economy in which success in business depends on close relationships between business people and governmental officials. Corporatism, control of a state or organization by large interest groups.
Marxism distorts what capitalism truly is. Collectivists actually believe that corporatism and cronyism is what capitalism actually is. This irrational sense of reasoning comes straight from Karl Marx. In more recent times, this fallacious interpretation has become more mainstream among the left. In our present time, most modern liberals that consider themselves as grassroots believe that the left and right political spectrum is redundant, but that is far from the genuine facts of the matter. Understanding the left and right political spectrum is crucial for properly understanding political and philosophic ideologies. Over time, the left and right spectrum has been distorted through much deception, mistranslation, and rhetoric in the mainstream. The origins of the left and right political spectrum derives from the seating arrangement of the French Revolutionary Parliament. The conservatives sat to the presiding officer's right, whereas the socialists sat to the presiding officer's left. Right. In politics, the portion of the political spectrum associated with the conservative political thought, the term derives from the seating arrangement of the French Revolutionary Parliament, in which the conservative representatives sat to the presiding officer's right. In the 19th century, the term applied to conservatives who supported authority, tradition, and property. Right. Encyclopedia Britannica, 2012. Left. In politics, the portion of the political spectrum associated in general with egalitarianism and popular or state control of the major institutions of political and economic life. The term dates from the 1790s, when in the French Revolutionary Parliament, the socialists sat to the presiding officer's left. Leftists tend to be hostile to the interests of traditional elites, including the wealthy and members of the aristocracy, and to favor the interests of the working class. See proletariat. Left, Encyclopedia Britannica, 2012. The most logical scientific view of the political spectrum would affirm that the extreme right would be 0% government, as opposed to the extreme left, where you would have totalitarianism, which means absolute power and control by the government. Anarchy would be no government whatsoever, and totalitarian ideologies would be fascism, communism, and socialism. Over the past century or so, conservatism would be considered just right of center, and modern liberalism just left of center. Over the past decades, we have seen both conservative and modern liberal ideologies slowly creep more and more to the left, thanks to our politicians, mainstream media, television, and Hollywood subjecting the world to cultural Marxism. Even conservative and libertarian ideologies have been politically divided the past 40 years over policies. The reason why conservative and libertarian philosophy should not have division, especially in the United States of America, is because libertarianism is exactly the principles that the West was founded on. And conservatives are preserving that philosophy, although at times they can do a bad job. A really interesting fact is that many libertarians happen to go by the term classical liberal, because prior to the First World War, liberalism was a right-wing philosophy till it was hijacked by the socialist left. Even the most influential economists of the 20th century, Milton Friedman, not only called himself a libertarian, but also referred to himself as being a liberal. But Milton distinguished himself from being a Hollywood liberal, which we now would refer to as the modern liberalism we know today. Classical liberalism is basically the exact same philosophy behind libertarianism. It's actually that simple, relatively speaking. In the early 20th century, the socialist labor parties slowly started hijacking the left. And coincidentally, around the same time, the progressive movement was hijacking the right. The only real difference being that there was a pushback from the right, and the progressives merely converged with their comrades in the labor and liberal parties. But any way you look at it, progressivism and modern liberalism is entirely a mask for socialism or even communism. And unlike today, back 30 to 40 years ago, most Westerners knew that socialism and communism are virtually parallel and are both unsustainable and immoral systems. The most funny and ironic thing about today's modern liberal is that there is nothing liberal about them. Moreover, another really easy perspective on the left and right political spectrum would be considered state or man-given rights as opposed to God-given rights. Now, a really interesting and peculiar affair we have progressively seen is Marxists and socialists united together with anarchists at Occupy and protest rallies here in North America as well as across the world. You must pray for these people, because they live in a philosophical and ideological paradox, and the only real thing that they do have in common with each other is that they both want to destroy the system that we live under, even though their reasons may be philosophically diametrical in nature. Throughout history, the anarchists have always helped overthrow governments, and really for no particular reason other than they want to destroy the government system. Unfortunately, the anarchist demonstrator has historically helped many brutal regimes come to power, and the usual gesture of acknowledgement from these regimes to the anarchists has been exile, imprisonment, and in many cases, execution.
When I first noticed the pattern in between Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and even here in Victoria, and other places all across Canada and all across the world in relation to the Occupy movement. Just the slick way that it was marketed through social media, how it was backed by Anonymous, and I mean, like, the whole thing gets me thinking, like, here's the United States, they have a Democrat president. They've declared cyber war on people, like there's a large cyber war going on, that they kept stressing it on their like news reports and stuff, and the only visible face of cyber war that's out there is, guess which group? Anonymous. And what is Anonymous? Anonymous is a partisan computer hacker group, okay, so there's barely any right-wingers in there. They're all left, they all believe in socialism or zeitgeist kind of scenarios where everybody moves into the mega city and lives in their smart loft or apartment or whatever, and they're more on that angle of social justice. And so I started following the lingo, the keywords: social justice, sustainable development, and I began to notice like how many parallels there are with what they were promoting and with what the United Nations was promoting, and it even piqued my interest even more in where was their agenda coming from when they said local governance while upholding international law. They were chanting that one day, and that's when I knew that these people, they are not here to change the world for the better. They're here to create a global new world order, and they're trying to sell it to us in any way possible. And so when I started digging into like where the funding's coming from, and I mean, you got to bear in mind, there's a couple of other people in Canada that were looking into this. There's Greg Renouf of Genuine Witty. He's a fairly competent researcher and has uncovered much of the funding in between, like, let's say, Occupy Vancouver and Occupy Toronto, and the various groups that operate with Occupy, which was renamed Idle No More. Same groups, just a different brand, like a different marketing opportunity for them, and they go by the same fingerprint every single time. So there's March Against Monsanto. Now, I'm not saying they're all infiltrated, right, but the vast majority of them are, especially when you're dealing with towns where there's universities that offer globalist kind of studies programs like global governance and political science, especially. Like, those departments seem to be proliferating this mindset the most. And when you trace back the like very very roots of where this mindset is coming from. It's coming from UNESCO to help promote the authority of the United Nations, which is not really highly regarded as authority here in Canada, because if they were, then the United Nations wouldn't be saying things like, oh, well, Agenda 21 is optional, which it's not. It's not optional. That's what these people were here for. They were here to sell us something that nobody would, in the rightful mind, would say yes to, because the society that they want to build is a very carefully metered and spied on Orwellian society, you know, with smart meters. We control how much food you get. We control how much water you get, because it's for the environment's own good, right? That's the kind of society that they want to build. We see militantism, which is a strategy of theirs where their implementation of communism requires the violent uprising. It's got its roots in Leninism and Stalinism. When you look in history, you see that typically the communist regime, when it gets into power, it requires large-scale violence. It requires the anarchists, because they serve as useful pawns on the chessboard. And after when the communist regime does get into power, typically the anarchists aren't wanted, because they're against the state. If the state does something that they don't like, then they're against the state. But that's only if they're like actually a real anarchist, right? I would consider myself a real anarchist. I don't believe in government. I believe in self-governance. I believe in sovereignty. Actually, just recently I realized, like, you know, a lot of the things that I believe in, there's a lot more common ground between my beliefs and the Indigenous than there are with these communists and the Indigenous, because the communists are there supplying them with the support, supplying them with the financial means. They're being there and providing the support in order to take advantage of their gratitude, right? So, I mean, when an Indigenous person sees that their environment's being trashed and industry isn't being responsible, well, the social parasites, the communists, come in and they throw their tides money at the problem, because what they want to take advantage of is the social, like the racial divide in between the two groups of people, right? They know that there's racial tension in between the Indigenous and white people, right? They know that it's always been there for the past 150 years. Plus there's also the residential schools issue, right? So our government treated the Indigenous like shit. And so they have, rightfully so, a chip on their shoulder. And that's just all strategy, like cards to play later on. That's how the communist thinks. They strategize and they know how to create wedges in between people, so that their ultimate goal, which is otherwise impossible to achieve, because I mean, you think about it, who really would like Canada to look like Soviet Russia? I wouldn't, and I'm pretty sure there isn't one other person in this library that technically would. Even the communists themselves who operate here in Victoria, that's the last thing that they would like to tell people that they want Canada to turn into, because if they did, nobody would buy it. It's an unsellable idea.
I got involved in all this when Occupy movement started. So Occupy Vancouver in October of 2011, when it was mentioned, I saw it. I've been watching Occupy Wall Street. I found it very interesting. And I started looking for a solution that we could have for the world, because I like solutions, not just complaining about the world. And I found the idea of take corporate money out of politics. Great platform, I thought, for Occupy. I took this then to Joyce Murray, who's a Liberal MP in my area, and I said, Joyce Murray, would you like to support this idea of taking corporate money out of politics? I actually sent it to every MP in British Columbia, and she responded. And she said, yes, I'll support you. I went to the first day of Occupy and I gave a speech explaining what's happening and the idea of taking corporate money out of politics. Had some conversations afterwards, and this is where things started falling apart. First was, you can't just take corporate money out of politics, you need to take union money out of politics. That made many people upset. But the main point where I noticed something was wrong was in the preparations for Occupy Vancouver. when people started promoting violence. Black bloc style violence, so what we saw during the G20 in Toronto and the Olympics in Vancouver, and starting from Seattle in 1999, the WTO. And people were promoting the concept that we need to consider violence. They shared a video that you can probably share here with Harsha Walia of No One Is Illegal Vancouver. And that video, it was her debating a man named Derek O'Keefe, who was a writer for Rabble up until recently, over should we be allowing violence in protest. It was right after they smashed the windows of the Hudson Bay in Vancouver, and he spoke against it, and Harsha Walia was promoting violence, saying the people who were in the Black Bloc were actually heroes. She said the people who de-arrest their colleagues from the police, meaning someone gets arrested and you grab them back and get a physical fight with the police, were heroes. When that video was released, people in Occupy Vancouver, many of them freaked out. We weren't supposed to be violent. Occupy was not a violent movement. And there was a debate that was started. It was a few people involved, but I stepped in on it. It was mainly Min Rice, who's a blogger, and she was once labeled as the most popular CDN poly blogger in Canada. But she spoke out about the violence, and she said, we can't have violence. I came in to back her and say we can't have violence, and the debate began at Occupy Vancouver. This was a week before we set up our tents. Okay. And from that point I realized there's something seriously wrong inside of activist movements in Canada. I started to notice, well, first very early on we noticed CUPE gave us a $20,000 donation. Who? CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Okay. They gave us $20,000. The money was going to people who were in the existing activist community, who weren't sharing any of the reporting on the money, and who weren't having finance committee meetings. So we noticed immediately there was a problem with money. We had collection jars at either end of the camp, big, large water bottles filled with cash, and no one knows where it went. But then we started noticing little things happening. I was on a committee at Occupy Vancouver, which was the policy committee, which we set up on the first planning day that we would have. When it came for Occupy to start, Harsha Walia and I were on this committee, and all of a sudden the committee was cancelled. No one explained who cancelled the committee. There was no vote inside of the General Assembly about stopping or changing committees. It just changed. And so we noticed that there were separate powers inside of Occupy very early on, but in Vancouver I don't think it was as obvious to me as it was when I arrived in Toronto. I was very new to the community, so it was quite a learning experience to understand the history behind these things. I showed up for an Occupy Toronto direct action meeting. The direct action is where you go on the streets and you either block traffic or do some sort of event that's disruptive. In the meeting was Dave Vasey, who we found out later is the leader of Occupy Toronto. Dave works with also the Christian Peacemaker team. He seems a bit of a Christian anarchist. Lana Goldberg, who was in the Direct Action Committee, and Lana Goldberg works with the Ontario Common Front and with the unions. So whenever you see a union event, it's her. And a few other occupiers. And I sat down there, and one of the people who was the marshals, I forget his name now, but he went up to Dave Vasey about 15 minutes after I was there with his BlackBerry. And then they all looked at me, and all of a sudden everything changed.
Oh, it's like they figured out who you were, you think?
They figured out who I was. They were waiting for me. They were expecting me. But I found like I was being tracked wherever I went anyway. Right after Occupy Vancouver, I went to live in Cortes Island in BC. It was a small remote island at a resort named Hollyhock. Hollyhock is led by the Tides Foundation. It was founded by one of the members of Greenpeace. I got there because I found an ad in Craigslist, if you want a place to stay, and I thought it said Hollyhock. I thought it was rather secluded. It's secluded and interesting, but also I had my concerns about foundations, and this was the training headquarters for one of the foundations, so I thought it was a good place to go. But when I arrived at Cortes Island, I found that someone from Occupy had sent mails to 50 people on the island saying that I'm dangerous and mentally ill.
Wow.
So they viewed me as a threat when I got to Cortez. When I arrived in Toronto, they viewed me as a threat. And they immediately separated the groups and pushed me into another group. And that day, I just felt something was wrong. But I also looked at Dave Vasey's computer. Dave Vasey's computer said on it Ruckus Society. And the Ruckus Society is a NGO based out of the US for training activists. It's been funded by Tides. I think it's been funded by the Cort Foundation and other foundations. And the Ruckus Society was one of the organizations responsible for the violence during the Seattle WTO in 1999. So as soon as I saw that, I knew something was happening in the reactions. Then I met in Toronto some other people who had been involved in Occupy, and they started giving me the inside information on who's who and who was running things. And I think the people at Occupy Toronto who were seeing problems saw them a lot more clearly than the people in Vancouver did. There were people at Occupy Toronto who showed up on day one knowing that there were foundations behind this and knowing that there's falsities. So I'll admit I was a little bit slow on this in Vancouver, and all of Vancouver was a little slow on this. But then as soon as I got here, I noticed that on the first incident.
So you're saying these foundations were indeed funding the violence within the Occupy action events?
I wouldn't.
In a sense?
No foundation has ever openly or publicly funded violence, but the foundations have funded organizations that have enabled violence. Everything about the Ruckus Society is a direct action training organization. And every major violent protest, there have been Ruckus Society members there. I don't think all Ruckus Society members are committing violence, but they're certainly part of the pack. When you look at the G20, or you look at the what happened in I think it's 1997 Republican Convention in Chicago, the way they use the crowds for the Black Bloc actions to happen, you can't smash up the city in a Black Bloc unless you have 20,000 people surrounding it, because you'll never get away with it. So Occupy is one of those events where the people who are on the anarchist side, or the people who believe in the need for violence, or the people who just accept the need for violence, were able to gather thousands of people together, but not enough. Right? If you look at how many people showed up to Occupy Toronto, there weren't really enough like the G20 to get away with it. If you look at the G20, they brought out the union members, they brought out the activists, and they brought out NGOs, and they all marched together, and right in the middle were the people who commit the violence, the Black Bloc.
Yeah.
And in Toronto, if you look at the pictures of the Black Bloc, standing in front of them was known as illegal, including Harsha Walia from Known as Illegal Vancouver, and her husband Harjap Grul, I never pronounced his name properly, from Known as Illegal Vancouver and from the Council Canadians. So when the violence happened in Toronto, you had the Black Bloc guys shielded by Known as Illegal, and Known as Illegal puts a couple of Indigenous people in front. They put a person in a wheelchair. They put people who the police would not want to interfere because it would be very bad PR. And then the Black Bloc break out.
So you think it was all by design, eh?
It is, and they didn't do this in the G20, but in the Republican Convention in Chicago, they gave people colors. And so one color was like green, and it's never arrest me. Another color was orange, which was, I don't mind being too close to the arrestable people. And the other one is the last color, I think it was red, which was, I'm getting arrested. And they made layers of people. One member of Occupy Toronto told me they did the color system for one of the Occupy protests also. So the only way that this political violence can happen and people can get away with it is if they have a crowd.
Okay, so you were talking about foundations funding, Occupy, like Ruckus and stuff. Like, what connections did you make by these foundations, like following the money trail further? You want to touch down on that?
Yeah, okay. Now I started looking at this, I had my hint that foundations were involved. I'll say that I don't know of any NGO funding Occupy other than the Council of Canadians. The Council of Canadians is led by a woman named Maud Barlow, who's a very well-known globalist. Maud Barlow promotes the idea of a one-world parliament in the United Nations.
Is she part of the United Nations Parliamentary Assembly?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
She was that. It's her. In Canada, we have herself, Elizabeth May.
Trudeau.
I don't see Trudeau on the list. Yeah, okay, and Chow is on the list. And in fact, I was just going through the list last week. And I've written about all these people. I didn't know they're part of an organization until I got to it. But so I started looking at foundation money going to the individual activists. So you look at Dave Vasey, for example, when I arrived. He was saying, I am completely grassroots, I always work alone, I don't have foundation money. But then you look, he worked with the Rainforest Action Network, which is funded by Tides and all the same groups. And I looked at Secura Saunders, who is one of the leaders of Occupy Toronto. And she'd previously worked with organizations, including Prometheus Radio, which was funded through Ford Foundation. She was previously with Cort Watch, which is funded by Soros Open Society Foundation. And you start looking at all the individual activists and how they're funded by the foundations. At first, they absolutely denied this. Even 2 weeks ago, Ezra Levant at Sun News was interviewing Secura Saunders, who's following him around. He said, so where do you get your money, Secura? And he said, do you get your money from Tides Foundation? She didn't say a word. But then, where are you getting your money? And she didn't. I live in a basement with my in-laws. And it turns out she didn't live in a basement with her in-laws. The week before, she announced she moved to Ottawa. And she's working with the People's Social Forum, which is the Canadian element of an organization called the World Social Forum. If you look at the website for the People's Social Forum, they pay $50,000 a year. So you start realizing that the professional activists are getting funding or support. But then we found the connection of many of these professional activists across the country all share the same tattoo.
Really?
It says, love is the movement.
Okay.
Dave Vasey's Love is the Movement, I think, is here. We have a number of main activists. I'll go through the list. Dave Vasey of Occupy Toronto has a Love is a Movement tattoo. Taylor Fluke of Occupy Toronto had the Love is the Movement tattoo. Chelsea Fluke of Occupy Edmonton, the leader of Occupy Edmonton, had the Love is the Movement tattoo. And we move on to another of other people who are involved in Occupy, including Clayton Thomas Mueller of the Indigenous Environmental Network. The IEN is funded by Tides, and Clayton leads a lot of the Indigenous movement.
Okay.
And many of these people had the same tattoo. And Ariel Derringer is the last one to mention. Ariel Derringer is with the Athabasca First Nation, Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. And she was one of the primary people involved in the Neil Young tour against the oil sands across the country. She's been to Hollyhock. You start taking the list of who's getting money from Tides, and then you start looking at the activists who are going to Tides training camp at Hollyhock. And the Love is the Movement group have direct connections to Hollyhock. And they all spend enormous amounts of time saying, we have no money from foundations. But they are supported all the way through. Tides brings in, the last few years, I think, $400 million into Canada, all for activism. Tides Foundation was initially based in the US, and they're based out of San Francisco.
Yeah.
They're what many people call a money laundering organization. Is Tides takes donations from people and then puts out money to other NGOs or other organizations. So Tides right now, the foundation, the US version, gets their money from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Pew Foundation, from the Hewlett Foundation, Packard Foundation, and Moore Foundation, more of Intel. just a few of the main donors. But let's look at the list of these people donating the money here. Rockefeller Foundation is funded by the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller family made all their money by creating Standard Oil. Rockefeller himself, one of the ways he got rich was by inventing the phrase pipeline politics. So Rockefeller would buy a refinery over here, and then he would, he'd try to buy the refinery over here, but the refinery wouldn't sell or they want too much money. So he ended up buying the plot of land that the pipeline goes through. And then he cuts off the pipeline and says, "Ha, your refinery is worthless. So now we will buy you for cheap." So manipulation of systems for pipelines was Rockefeller's business. He invented it. The Pew Foundation. The Pew family comes from the Sunoco Oil, which was one of the oil companies that worked with Rockefeller and big oil powers. This is a lot of research that came out of Vivian Krauss with the Financial Post. Was that the people who are leading the fight against Canadian industry are American oil barons. So Tides is very well funded by the established rich left American. And the Soros actually Foundation also gives them money. In Canada, Tides set up Tides Canada. Tides Canada is a separate separate organization. But here's how the money works. If you're a billionaire who wants to stop Canadian oil projects, you will give money to Tides Foundation. Tides Foundation will give that money in an account to Tides Canada. And Tides Canada will send that money out to whoever is protesting the Canadian industry. So here we have a very non-transparent way of moving money to fund the activist world. So my view of what's happening is that individual Canadians are losing their power to foreign influencers, which is just not right. Maybe some of the things I agree with. Actually, I do agree with many of the things Tides does and other foundations do and the environmental movement does. There are many good, positive things. Do we need to make sure that tailings ponds in the oil sands are not killing birds? Absolutely. So the first person to complain about it, bring it up and help us get better, that's a positive thing. But their ultimate goal is a question. Why are foreign oil baron family foundations funding to stop Canadian oil? It's all very curious.
Okay, so we've watched a lot of like a proliferation of social revolutions occur that are being marketed virally over the internet, and those organized collectives are always like seemingly the same structure, the same facilitators, the same kind of like partisanship, the same strategies. The organizations themselves might have like different names and stuff, but their lingo always matches. They always push sustainable development, which is also another word for Agenda 21. They have a propensity towards demonstrating solidarity with anarchists. And so when they're confronted directly about how they support them, they like to deny that they do that, but they actually do support the anarchists because, I mean, how else are these people getting their money? And we've been able to directly connect Tides money with many of these facilitators and activistocrats, we like to call them. That's kind of the nickname we gave them. For Occupy, we called them facilitators, because these were not real people. They were highly trained. They often came from organizations such as Hollyhock. They had very specific religious kind of views, like the earth is a mother kind of thing. I don't believe that. That's not part of my religion, but that's kind of their religion. It's more tribalism, so they'd enjoy tattoos and like weird body piercings and stuff, and like that's it. Just they would take that kind of stuff to an excess. They would take the drugs to an excess as well. So like at their encampments and stuff, they would say, well, these people, they're underprivileged and they're always looked down upon by society. But I mean, let's face it, they were using drug addicts to make their numbers look larger, and when they got kicked out of their camps, they had actually recruited more people and then they rebranded themselves several times because they want to branch out into like every possible activist cause and cover both sides as much as possible. So we see them infiltrating the truth movement, which I mean these are tactics that communists engage in. They want to control the debate. They want to steer people into a one common unitarianistic kind of goal, and it quite literally is a cult. They use the same techniques as the Heaven's Gate. They bang on the drum, they chant, and I mean there's the element of drugs that we saw in Vancouver where they were like doing drugs, and I mean here in Victoria they had inside their tent city, we were cleaning up heroin needles, and almost every single day that we went there, there's somebody, you know, hanging around with a 26er of like vodka or whatever, and cops standing around looking at it all, and they wouldn't do anything about it. And that's the most curious thing of all, is that the police, when they notice these people behaving this way, when they see them breaking the law, and they just stand there and do nothing about it most of the time. They let them get away with it. Whereas if somebody were a free man or a libertarian or some other like ideology, they would get cracked down on pretty fast. And I mean, with my involvement with Weird Change, when I saw them setting up and organizing events and stuff, I mean, they would have to deal with harsher circumstances and restrictions than this collective that would set up a seminar over at University of Victoria through the Students' Union and VIPIRG, and the VIPIRG thing. There's PIRG organizations all over the place, and they claim to be for the public interest, but it's not really that. It's totally about the social justice, the sustainable development, the communism, the get rid of the borders and destroy sovereignty because we are all one kind of hollyhock, woo-woo cult type of ideology. I mean, that's how these people think. They cancel out their own thoughts with singing bowls, and they use each other like by milking information out of them. They get you to, it's kind of like a mini confessional. You get to tell them your sins or whatever, and then they gain more insight into who you are. And then they use that knowledge that they discover as leverage to psychologically target individuals who would be useful as tools for them. They're very strategic at what they do. The people that coordinate the individuals that are coming out of the universities that have been taught all this crap in their political science programs and their environmental law, for example, or global governance. They've got a whole bunch of these programs at the university now. It's like that you pay taxes, your tax dollars goes to the government that funds an organization called CIGI, Center for International Governance, which then creates program material that gets disseminated into local universities like UVic, for example. There's also University of Alberta and Ryerson, and quite literally the top universities in Canada. And their programs are designed to indoctrinate people into this stuff, and your tax dollars is paying for it. This new breed of people who would like to undermine the idea of Canada and turn it into something else, the world or global government, or decolonize whatever, that idea is coming from your own tax dollars, and the Rockefellers, and the Ford Foundation, which are all U.S. organizations. Well, I'm sorry, I would like to have an identity separate from the United States. If you watch the news and you see how they treat people in that country now, how they soil the Constitution, that's because it's the same clique of individuals that are like basically running the government, and they're inside of our government as well. I mean, if you look at David Eby, who pulls all of his legal observers during the Vancouver 2010 Olympics, And it just so happens to be like the exact moment when they're, you know, going smashy with the anarchist rioters, right? You can kind of see that there's a pattern there of people on the inside who are just intentionally and willfully turning a blind eye to what's actually going on. So when you look at CSIS, for example, and CSIS is totally underplaying the threat of eco-terrorism, right? And there's countless individuals pointing it out. You know that they actually read the articles because people watch their websites and see actual government addresses showing up as in their visitors list, and you can tell what articles they're reading too. And there's no justification for the downplaying of eco-terrorism because it's a very big thing. It's something that I think has already happened several times in Canada and is going to happen a lot more as these pipelines get built up. The whole idea and concept of what these people are all about is interdependency.
Hi, my name's Greg Hill with WeAreChangeVictoria.org and Freedom Free for All TV here in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. My thoughts on the crazy radical left is derived from a lot of key areas that you can see influence in Canada, especially in terms of the institutionalization of radical left activities and education within our post-secondary institutions primarily. You see professors, you know, that are getting promoted, they become professor emeritus, they receive substantial funding from the Canadian government at these top universities, University of British Columbia, University of Victoria, to spread a message of government control over the prices in a marketplace and also into the control of your life, and the put themselves in a position of having entitlement over your personal morals. And that is immoral in and of itself, to think that somebody else has control over what is to be moral or immoral. And through these post-secondary institutions, they're feeding people to continue to believe in the lie that government needs to protect you from yourself. And one of the key institutions that has popped up recently in Canada is the Centre for International Governance and Innovation, called CIGI. And this was founded in the mid-2000s, I believe, by the former CEO of Research in Motion, which is Jim Basile. And this is a very wealthy man. So he helped use his contacts in Ontario and across the country to get government funding at provincial and federal levels from various departments to set up this institution out of Waterloo, Ontario. And they've, in fact, in the 2010-2011 fiscal year, received over $30 million in cumulative funding from various bodies of the government of Canada to set up. And now they're a $200 million fund that is promoting globalism and writing papers from University of Victoria professors and others to discuss ways to separate Canadian monetary sovereignty from itself and move to a globalized standard under the World Bank for their special drawing rights. And actually a paper that I have here, it's called 5 Years After the Fall. It was written by Professor Barry Caron, who is Associate Director for the Centre of Global Studies at the University of Victoria. They talk about the Green Superfund, and in this Green Superfund, how it would act as an umbrella, the fund of all funds. And the intention is to raise $1 trillion in capital, and how to spend that $1 trillion within 5 years to manipulate the minds of citizens all over the world through their institutionalization of this reporting of these concepts, to then give credence to the United Nations and other major non-governmental organizations to collaboratively spend $1 trillion on so-called green initiatives, which I don't know about you, but I didn't have any say in whether or not I participated in funding these programs. Yet I'm a so-called citizen of the country of Canada, but these people want to undermine my individual sovereignty and my ability to support things by automatically giving money in our name to corrupt institutions like the United Nations and the World Bank. And so in this report they talk about giving up monetary sovereignty, and they mention perhaps the most necessary condition for radical change is incrementality. And they talk about a series of small steps and moving to a euro currency, for example, and how that was only a suggestion, several decades ago, and now it's actually come to fruition. They talk about how they could raise the $1 trillion, and they describe new issuance of special drawing rights from the World Bank as its own currency, increasing carbon taxes, using a means to leverage SDRs, or special drawing rights, taxes on financial transactions and billionaires and currency transactions, as well as emissions trading on air passengers in the form of a levy. They say specifically that the solution must be an apparent free lunch. Only such vehicle is the innovative use of special drawing rights. They also go into, for this green climate fund, they would issue $1 trillion in bonds backed by $100 billion in in US dollars in SDR equity for a leverage ratio of 10 to 1. So they speak specifically about already inflating this special drawing rights currency at a ratio of 10 to 1. Inflation is one of the most harmful taxes and abuses on individuals known to man. Inflation erodes the purchasing power of the individual, and the people that receive that money last, which is more often not the poorest people in society, have the most to lose, because inflation, by the time the money trickles down from the government through to the large corporations, down to small businesses, and then to the employees, and then down to the poor when the government issues welfare checks and things like that, the inflation is absolutely massive. And they go to the grocery store and it's all your food costs are way up. Your dollar doesn't buy as much anymore. And they purposely talk about in this document inflating the currency ratio of 10 to 1. And I find that absolutely despicable, because currency is something that connects everybody. And it's another thing that you never hear from the radical left, them ever talk about inflation or the national debt. They only ever talk about how the federal government should give them more money, or how the federal government isn't giving them enough money to fund their to pay for things that poor people don't have. But you never hear them talk about the $160 million a day that we pay on the interest accruing on our national debt. $160 million a day. Do you know how much that could pay for it? But no, we're paying that on the interest of our national debt. These people don't have a clue how to get into the economics, the economic realities of currency manipulation and price controls. But if they could only open their eyes and see that what the economics look like, and how inflation is ravaging people everywhere, then they would get to the heart of the most insidious monster that we're facing, and that's currency manipulation. So as part of the Center for International Governance and Innovation's fundraising mechanism they proposed for this green super fund to spend $1 trillion, we look at fractional reserve banking, and we know that is the culprit of driving massive inflation, and they use this quantitative easing to increase access to cash. But what they're doing is just driving the value of the dollar down. But in this report, they speak to some of the likely criticisms of quantitative easing, how they want to have this $1 trillion at a leverage ratio of 10 to 1. So they speak of some of the potential criticisms of this, and they include the danger of a world central bank leading to the eventual loss of national sovereignty, the excessiveness of the sums involved, that reserve assets are intended to be reserves and should not be diverted for other purposes, that inflation will result. The scheme creates off-balance sheet liabilities for contributing governments in a non-transparent fashion. That success would unleash a flood of unlimited requests to use special drawing rights, quantitative easing for development and other general purposes. So they know that these are massive risks, but still this is the proposal, this is the plan. And it absolutely just makes me sick, and people watching this should go and take a look at who these people are, and the fact that they are so brazen to actually put this into their key reporting and literature that they're sharing with the public, and that they're teaching in these institutions, post-secondary institutions. You know, it's all laid out, and I implore people to follow the money. Journalism 101, follow the money.
So we've established where the money goes, how it's obfuscated, how people hide their identities, how all of this seemingly dovetails into Anonymous, for example, and that's another thing that I'd like to get into is when Occupy Wall Street was announced, guess who was there promoting it? Anonymous. They were there promoting it. Same thing with Bitcoin, they're promoting it. It seems to me like Bitcoin is a digital cryptocurrency geared towards the exact task of global currency. And now we've seen, like, you know, the cryptocurrencies proliferate out into like a multitude of different cryptocurrencies such as Dogecoin and Kanye coin. I believe that what these all are just like replicas. So if one fails, or they can make one fail, and then they could steal a whole bunch of money by making one fail, and then people rush to the next currency that's available, like Dogecoin, for example, which is being backed by Apple, and specifically they removed Bitcoin to monetize the whole Dogecoin market that's going to be arising. And recently it started to look like the Bitcoin currency is not as distributed and invulnerable as they were claiming, because I mean, with the recent attacks where people can no longer withdraw money from Mt. Gox and a variety of other Bitcoin vendors, we're seeing that maybe there isn't money there for people to, like, you know, collect value from their Bitcoins. Because I mean, in the end, all these coins are is just ones and zeros. They're made up, make-believe. They're not even actually really mined. I mean, you can arguably say that because a computer solved a problem that did absolutely nothing other than create currency, that it costs something, but it really doesn't. That cost is something that is moot in the world of quantum computing. And these people, they'll argue that, you know, in the future they'll adapt the currency to fit those needs. But the reality of it is we're being offered all these alternatives, and our market's being intentionally sabotaged because they want our dollar to collapse along with the American dollar to foment the kind of chaos that they need so that they can bring in the new. When people are left with no other choice but to pick another currency, right? You know, if they're attributing Bitcoin to libertarianism, a lot of people are going to flock there because they want their freedom, but they're not going to realize that it's a big honey trap until it's too late, until their money is already gone. And so a lot of Anonymous's funding came from Bitcoin. They were early adopters. They had the computer equipment to do a lot of mining. Without a doubt, if they were smart about what they were doing, if they were actually using their funds for things, they would have converted it into something of real value, like actual cash, and they would be applying it towards the cyber war. And like I said, it's the only visible face of cyber war. What makes you really think that it's for we the people that are like behind the whole thing? I mean, you look into the leadership. There was Sabu, who was an FBI informant, and there's like the attacks that they use. They'll attack a target, and they'll use teenagers, kids on their computers and stuff through IRC channels and whatnot to act as a subterfuge, like a distraction, so that the authorities can, when they do their token address, arrest, they can go and arrest some of these children, and now it's not the military-industrial complex that's running anonymous. It's a kid in his basement using a computer, which is not true at all. The real people who are pulling the strings, they're power players. They have billions of dollars. They don't want people to know exactly what they're doing, but I mean, the agenda is perfectly clear with what they're doing. They're pushing people into a situation where they have to react, and then they're providing the solution, kind of employing Hegelian dialect, problem, reaction, solution. So we've been looking at what's been going on with the IPCC, for example, and they've been involved in a considerable amount of fraud in pushing this whole global warming thing, which now has morphed into climate change. And I mean, right away I'm thinking to myself that, okay, hold on a minute, these people, they said global warming and they were wrong. And so we should not trust them because they were already wrong once. They didn't think for themselves, and they still treat the people who told them that they were wrong like crap. You'd think that the fact that somebody clued into it earlier than when it was actually revealed, that it would lend a little bit more credibility with those people. But we see the exact opposite, that anybody who's an early warning whistleblower to that kind of an activity, they're often vilified and excluded from their conversations because they don't need people who are troublemakers. They want people to go along with the agenda. And so the whole psychology of what's behind their system, how they handpick people to invite to their training seminars, and they teach people a system, and then when they discover that they're leadership material, they provide them with additional training, maybe give them free vacations or a bit of extra cash here and there, or even a job. Even a job as let's say writers in media, and a lot of the positions that they target, I mean, it's stuff that's written about in the history books about how communism is rolled out. They target your education institutions, and they want to get at people while they're young. They want to get them indoctrinated into a certain program so that when they get old enough and they seize the reins, that it's their ideology that's proliferating out of these people. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing that kind of a situation within our education system. And so naturally what these people will do, they'll target teachers, federations, student unions, and they especially appreciate unions because there's always strength in numbers, and it provides a power consolidation where all you have to do is corrupt one guy and you've got the whole thing. You've got all this political power at your fingertips through the unions, and it really doesn't take much at all to infiltrate them. And I mean, these are issues that Canadians and Americans and even people all across Europe have gone through. I mean, even during the 1930s it was a popular thing. People were aware of the politics back then. But we've been so detached from what actually happens for long enough. There's a generation gap, right? The only people that really know about it is your grandfather, and that's if they're still alive or whatever, right? And your generation, my generation, has not known these things, so we're a little bit naive. We don't know what to look out for. We're easily taken advantage of when one of these individuals who believes in, let's say, Maoism or anarcho syndicalism, which is what I would think is the equivalent of communism, because a traditional anarchist will typically not want any government at all. They want to be self-managing. They want to regulate their own life and not be interfered with, unless if there's a good reason to interfere with what those people are doing, right? And that's what a real anarchist is. But these people, these communists, they've had to assume that role as well, because they want to take advantage of people who are disgruntled by the system that they're throwing a wrench in and sabotaging. So when your average citizen looks at their contribution, you know, oh, I'm paying $400 a paycheck every 2 weeks in taxes, and what are you really getting back? And they you know, try to account for what they're getting back, and it's like pennies on the dollar. And of course it pisses people off. It makes them not want to pay tax. It makes them want to avoid using electronic banking systems and things where like the paper trail is auditable, and where their income can be traced and taxed even more, right? So here in Canada, you visibly see a prolific underground economy. And that's the target of these people. They wanted to destroy the underground economy because that's the biggest threat to statist power.
Convictions against collectivism. You cannot have individual freedom unless you have financial freedom. And that is a basic principle that the majority of modern liberals cannot understand. We have seen time and time again communism versus capitalism, whether it be USA versus USSR, North Korea versus South Korea, or West Germany versus East Germany. We have always seen communism on the losing end both economically and philosophically. Wherever you have had an increase in the standard of living, it has been in a capitalist society. The only real reasons capitalism is failing is because of all the socialism that has been implemented in our capitalist system that is slowly destroying our Western culture and civilization. Socialists will constantly try to convince you that countries like Iceland, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are all socialist countries that work. But the fact of the matter is that they use a free market system which is absolutely antithetical to socialism principles, theory, and practice. Even the so-called Scandinavian socialist model is economically in decline because of all the socialism that is occurring outside of the free markets. One of the main mathematical principles for basic economics is that you cannot multiply wealth by dividing it. The fact that people can base their economic beliefs, principles, and policies behind a simple conception based on a theory of increasing wealth and the standard of living by decreasing the capital that is ultimately driving the force of the economy is not only perplexing, but it is an absolute fallacy. When you have a system where there is a perpetual division of wealth from the private enterprise, you are not only coercively stealing money and decreasing the budget that the employer uses to pay their employees' salaries, but you are also eliminating profit margins and gains that could ultimately lead to the growth of employment and benefits for the working class. This is a very simple perspective. When you are oppressing a business, you are oppressing its employees. Whether you're increasing taxes on private enterprise or an individual, you will not only have decreased standards of incentives, but the total number of exchanges will decrease, therefore decreasing the overall tax revenue along with decreasing wealth creation. But there is one incentive that raising taxes provides private enterprise and individuals with. This is referred to as tax evasion. We have seen all 4 times that a United States president has lowered taxes, there was an increase in tax revenue directly as a result from lowering taxes. Another thing we must keep in mind is the Laffer curve. You can see that Obama's taxing policy, along with his other policies, is absolutely counterproductive. In 2011, the taxes collected from the wealthiest 10% in America accounted for more than 50% of all tax revenue collected in the United States of America for that year. With that said, the rich are paying more than their fair share of taxes, despite what the Marxists, commies, liberals, and media will tell you. Free markets versus government control. Let's get a few things clear. Most capitalists I know do not believe in the Federal Reserve System because it creates an excessive amount of inflation and public debt. It is just as simple as that. And most Marxists have a hard time differentiating between between corporatism, crony capitalism, and free market capitalism. I can sympathize with the idea that a factory can be run and operated by its workers and employees in a share-type system. But keep in mind, this is 100% possible in a free market voluntarist system. But to try and subject a population of people to this standard by coercion is not only fascist, but it is the epitome of the ideology of communism. Incentive is the one key component behind capitalism. Without competitive markets, you lose incentives. And without incentives, you lose the quality of work and infrastructure. You must have a system of competition, or the full human potential can never be achieved. The less government we have in our lives, the less chance there is for the accumulation of debt on the taxpayer. Government business debt is on the taxpayer, and the private business debt is on the business owner. Simply by using common sense, we should all be embracing privatization over the expansion of the government in the respect of true prosperity. The economy doesn't need government intervention to recover. In fact, it has proven time and time again that it only makes it worse. But it can recover itself with the power of the free market. If the government wasn't in control of our economy, you would not only see the free market system thrive, but the standard of living would increase as well as the decline of crime. You must also exhibit that politicians are not the individuals creating the wealth. The upper class are the people creating the wealth. The upper class is not only responsible for developing markets, but providing jobs and the tax base for the government. Regulations and taxes are always perpetuating, and will always lead to the expansion of the government. And the expansion of the government leads to reckless spending of our money. Ultimately, this reckless spending leads to debt. Debt leads to poverty, and poverty leads to crime and famine. On a side note, government lobbying is also a consequence of an expanding government. It's very discombobulating to most people that have studied the dangerous ideologies of the past that have not only proven to fail, but have committed genocide on more innocent people than any other religion, organization, or government system in the known history of humankind. As the saying goes, history has a strange way of repeating itself. The only positive thing that I can say about the criminalization of marijuana is that it has provided proof of how prosperous and great the free market really is. Over the past 15 years that I have observed the marijuana market, the price has not increased at all, and the product has only been progressing in quality. I really like to make this point clear because people can really relate to this, especially the people who have been consuming cigarettes as well as marijuana over this time period.
Now, probably one of the most simple and important lessons from Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, is the 4 ways you can spend money.
Well, you know, you can spend your own money on yourself. And when you spend your own money on yourself, you're very careful of what you spend it on, and you make sure that you get the most for your dollar. You can spend your own money on somebody else. You give gifts to other people. You take people out to dinner. And when you spend your own money on somebody else, you're very careful that you don't spend too much. You try to keep down the amount you spend, but you don't worry very much about what the other fellow's getting from it. You don't pay anything like as much attention to the gifts you buy for other people as to the things you buy for yourself. Or you can spend somebody else's money, as when you're spending the government's money. I say the government's money, the taxpayers' money, which the government has control over. Now you're spending somebody else's money. Let's say you're spending your boss's money. You're out to lunch on an expense account, but you're spending it on yourself. You're very careful that you get good things for your money. You try to have a good lunch and pick the right things, but you're not very much worried about whether you get the cheapest.
Spend all you want.
Spend all you want. You'll be careless. Now, what happens when you spend somebody else's money on somebody else? You're a distributor of welfare funds. Well, you're interested in making your own life as good as you can, and most people have humane instincts and want to do the best they can, but you're not going to be anything like as careful in spending somebody else's money on somebody else. So there are 4 ways in which you can spend money. And we have in our book, Free to Choose, a little box which shows this. On one side of that box is your money, somebody else's money. On the other side of that top part of that box are two columns, on yourself or on somebody else. And that corner box where you spend money on yourself is when you really get your money's worth. And the rest, the worst of all, is the right-hand box, when you spend somebody else's money on somebody else.
And that explains the schools today.
That explains the schools today. You're right. All so-called public schools, government schools, people are spending somebody else's money on somebody else. The teacher isn't spending his own money on the children. He's spending the taxpayers' money on the children. And that goes throughout the system, absolutely.
Moving forward, I must outline the difference between modern liberalism and classical liberalism. And most people don't know the difference between the two, but I'm going to take a quick shot at briefly trying to distinguish the two. Classical liberalism is basically the exact same philosophy behind libertarianism. It's actually that simple, relatively speaking. In the early 20th century, the socialist labor parties slowly started hijacking the left. Coincidentally, around the same time, the progressive movement was hijacking the right. The only difference being that there was pushback from the right, and the progressives merely converged with their comrades in the labor and liberal parties. But any way you look at it, progressivism and modern liberalism is entirely a mask for socialism or communism. And unlike today, back 30 to 40 years ago, people knew that socialism and communism are virtually parallel and are both unsustainable and immoral systems. The most funny and ironic thing about today's modern liberal is that there is nothing liberal about them. Another myth I am inclined to tackle is the oxymoron pseudo-term that liberals love to refer conservatism as, which is right-wing fascism. First, we must establish which of the core tenets are that of a right-wing ideology. In all entirety, I don't think you could account for any of the tenets which would be that of a small government in the complete spectrum of the core tenets of fascism. In fact, we can actually correlate all of the core tenets with that of a left-wing ideology.
There is also another mainstream myth that Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime were right-wing fascists. Not only were they not right-wing nor fascists, but it is a matter of fact that they were socialists. The Nazi Party became the byname of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and behold the infamous quote, "We are socialists. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance. And we are all determined to destroy the system under all conditions. Adolf Hitler."
Most people I come across that are Democratic Party cheerleaders can't differentiate between the term Democratic Constitutional Republic and the term democracy, as well as having no knowledge of political history. In the United States of America, you have a constitutional republic, which by definition is a form of government system where the supreme power lies in a body of citizens who can elect people to represent them, with the constitutional law system that puts restrictions on government power from infringing on the citizens' unalienable rights. Whereas the term democracy is virtually defined as majority rule of the people, or from a Marxist perspective, you could define it as social equality. But that is why there is a constitution in place, because what happens if the majority is wrong? Well, I can tell you what happens. The collectivists will collapse your economy, starve your people, destroy your country, and kill anyone who criticizes them or stands in their way.
The end justifies the means, also known as for the greater good. There are many tactics that the left will use to try and defeat their competition, and in many cases by any means necessary. The Marxist ideology imposes the belief that the end justifies the means. And this goes hand in hand with Marxism, and just take a look at the policies of Mao Zedong, Vladimir Lenin, Pol Pot, Joseph Stalin, and Che Guevara, and you will see how it is implemented in practice. The number of people in the peace movement using Che Guevara as a symbol of peace is absolutely astonishing. Oh, the irony. If only they knew that he was a savage murderer who happened to be Fidel Castro's personal executioner. It's a well-documented fact that Che Guevara and Fidel Castro killed anyone that opposed their communist revolution and promised supporters that they could keep their land, but when Fidel Castro obtained total control, he collectively seized everyone's land. Non sequitur is a reply that has no relevance to what preceded it, or a conclusion that does not follow from the premise.
Perhaps my favorite non sequitur used by everybody on the left, from the fondest socialists to the hardcore Marxists and everyone in between, is that somehow somebody else's success is incident upon someone else's failure. While this may be true in some cases, it is not necessarily true. And the way the left implements a progressive income tax, it would have to be necessarily true because it applies to everybody, which this assertion does not. Another absurd non sequitur used by Marxism is the derivation of moral claims from naturalism. Now, naturalism is implicit in Marxist theory, and naturalism holds that we are equal to the rest of nature because we are merely a product of it. Now, if we're equal to the ground that we walk on, it then becomes inexplicable why we get to walk on the ground and the ground doesn't get to walk on us, so to speak. And seeing as how this is clearly not the case if you look at the lifestyles of humans nowadays, it just doesn't fit together. Why we get to live the way we do and say, you know, dogs and cats and raccoons and stuff don't get to get free health care and all the rest of it, because we are just merely a product of nature, and somehow we get to derive moral claims from that.
Non sequitur.
Ad hominem is an argument directed to the personality, prejudices, previous words, and actions of an opponent, rather than an appeal to pure reason. It appeals to personal considerations, rather than to fact or reason. Character assassination is the most prominent form of ad hominem used by the radical left. When you are engaged in a discussion, conversation, or debate, and your adversary starts insulting your character, rather than debating principles and reason, you know you are winning the conversation, and you must not let your emotions get to you. Calmly resist the temptation of retaliation, and persist with your convictions and stay focused on the topic. Just keep in mind, the more they are insulting your character, the more you have the upper hand. The best strategy to quickly deal with character assassination is to always remain meek and politely ask them what about the attack on your character pertains to the present facts of the argument. Innuendo is an oblique referring or insinuating. An instance of such hinting always critical and usually malicious. An indirect and usually malicious implication. Innuendo is used by the left prominently by exploiting minority groups. You will see the radical left constantly calling Christians homophobes, Republicans racist, and conservatives misogynistic. Here are some examples of innuendo. The Republican voted against affirmative action because he is racist. Ironically enough, the radical left believe that job entitlements based on the color of your skin isn't racist at all, and that people who disagree with that are racist. Christians and conservatives are against abortions because they are misogynistic. Believe it or not, this is the guys behind the attacks on the people that advocate against savagely killing babies in the womb. Abortion has become such a mainstream method of birth control that people really don't see it for what it really is. Christians and conservatives are intolerant and hateful for not supporting gay pride parades. Now, at these events, homosexual men and women parade around the public streets naked, acting like perverts. And ironically enough, if a heterosexual person were to act like this in public, they would be immediately thrown in jail. And this is all funded by the public tax dollars. A group of conservative parents tried to stop the school boards from teaching grade 3 students about homosexuality, gender identity, and masturbation because they are homophobic and hateful people. Now, this really bothers me because I am absolutely against the sexualization of children. It's not only wrong, but it is satanic. The KKK is in support of small government. Therefore, all libertarians are racist. Now, believe it or not, I have seen this brought up in the media many times, but by using the same train of thought, we could say pedophiles use computers. So anyone that uses a computer is a pedophile. Yeah, it's completely foolish on every level. Emotional extortion, or emotional blackmail, is a technique used to sway opinion by emotion rather than by reason. You see this presently being used in areas such as gun control, terrorism, global warming, sustainability, and social justice. Irrelevance or diversion is a technique used in conversation that diverts direction of a conversation by not acknowledging the premise of the question. Do not be persuaded off topics in discussions or debates. You'll see such terms used in many different forms. The big "what if" is a great example. Now let's look at this used in a conversation. Watch how I am able to use irrelevance with emotional extortion. Matt. Mandatory car insurance is a restriction of our God-given freedoms and contravenes our Bill of Rights. Stacy. What happens if you accidentally kill someone in a car crash? Now, do you see how Stacy did not try to argue Matt's point? She simply diverted the conversation away from the principal argument with emotional extortion. You will find that you will have to cite definitions in debates and discussions because the radical left creatively redefines words, terms, and meanings. Whether it be a simple dictionary definition or even an ideology itself, they will completely change whatever they can to meet their criteria. Now here's an example of redefinition proudly lauded by a left-wing radical. National Post posted an article stating that denial of abortion among Irish hospitals, cascade of mistakes that led to miscarrying a woman's death. Now, I replied to this post stating, one death isn't comparable to the number of lives saved from abortion denial. Liberal hypocrisy. Miss Jody B replied, freedom of choice. I replied back, having the freedom to kill babies that have a beating heart isn't a good thing to be gratifying. It's quite savage. Miss Jody B replied back, everyone has their own definition of savage. Pro-choice. I replied back once again, stating, not everyone tries to redefine words, especially the ones with common sense. Now, Miss Jody B was literally redefining a word so that it could meet her criteria. This is classic pro-abortion, anti-intellectualism. The Delphi method is a structured communication technique, which is a systematic, interactive forecasting method which relies on a group of anonymous conspirators.
I'll give a good example here. It was one of the early incidents we had at Occupy Vancouver. This was it was after our GA, someone did a presentation to the group, and it was talking about equity and equality and how we make sure that women are treated equally to men, to trans people, to gay people. It was a very positive conversation. It was exactly what should be. But then the person giving the presentation, right at the end, says, we're going to have a meeting about this. We'd like to invite people to sign up. The first meeting is women and trans people only. All of a sudden, people in the crowd are going, what? What? Very upset. There's one woman who was mentally ill who was with Occupy who freaked out. She because she was so offended. I talked to her for 3 hours afterwards to try to get her back into place. But as soon as the people started getting angry, a few people in the crowd, who later on it became obvious that they were all friends, stood up and put their hands up. This is all okay, this is good. What's wrong with you? So when the people in the crowd began to get offended, other people in the crowd began to stand up for the speaker who offended everyone. And they would start getting accusatory with people who disagreed. It was their way of weeding people out. Because 3 people walked away from the movement at that moment. But that was okay to them. Because if those people walked away from the movement because they were offended with what they said, they didn't want them there in the first place. So there's a tactic called the Delphi technique, which my understanding it was created by the Rand Foundation. Delphi teaches you how to manipulate people in a crowd. If you search on YouTube, you'll find some videos on this. And what you do is you get people in the crowd to follow along and to be on your side, and you get another person in the crowd to say something that's very objectionable, and it gets people angry. Because the minute people get angry, they lose. The minute the one man stood up after she said, "This meeting will be for women only," and he started screaming, they called him, "You sexist, da 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 da." They attacked him. So it's a very good way of cleaning out and taking control is by finding out who's on your side and who's not on your side, getting who's not on your side angry to the point where either they leave in disgust or the rest of the crowd looks at them and goes, "That guy's angry." It's very subtle. But for Delphi to work, there have to be people in the room who know each other. And so what I see in their tactic of manipulating groups is they held the conversation, and in Occupy Toronto, they made the facilitators in Occupy Vancouver. All Occupies, actually. And facilitators had to be trained. But who made up the training course for facilitators? It was the people who wanted to run the facilitation. So in Occupy Toronto, when things started getting questionable when I arrived, and some people started asking questions, and people inside of Occupy Toronto were alongside with me, they started Delphiing me out. They started trying to offend me. The reason I succeeded so long with these people, though, is I don't get offended. So if you want to beat them at their game, when they start Delphiing you, when they start trying these tactics to marginalize you in the crowd, don't feed into it. Don't ever get angry. Don't ever scream at anyone. Don't ever say bad words. Don't ever accuse anyone of anything. Go, "That's very nice, but I still disagree with you." Be very calm, and then they can't win. The only way they seem to win is by getting people angry.
Interesting. When it comes to strategies that you see what they're doing on the local level, if you criticize the agenda, and it is a common agenda, if you criticize that agenda and you start throwing wrenches of your own into it, you'll get DMC reports like crazy on your website. It's like you're trying to communicate something for educational purposes, and you shouldn't have to worry about copyright because, I mean, there's that kind of a liberty that was ruled upon by the Supreme Court. But these people, they want to kill that. They don't want evidentiary-based arguments. They want, because it totally shreds their irrational arguments that you're white privileged, so therefore you're racist, kind of thing, or you're a homophobe, and or you're a misogynist. I mean, those labels are some of their most effective weapons. They just label you that, and then all of their followers show solidarity in the decision that they made to label you that. And so they've got mechanisms for destroying credibility. They've got mechanisms for actually hurting people. So, I mean, there's this nebulous cloud of people that will call you with death threats and stuff if they get your phone number, if you're criticizing them. Everybody who's been a critic of them has basically received these random threats. Myself, I believe Josh Steffler's received random threats. There's been a number of individuals here in Victoria and in Toronto who've experienced the same thing. So it's a common experience within the collective that if you don't go along and get along, then they have to get you out of the way. So they have their anarchists, which engage in violence, and the whole idea is to intimidate you into not speaking about them and not catching them when their pants are down and when they screw up, because these people, they always screw up. Because, I mean, when somebody's trying to push a big lie, like they are, a big lie of like utopian society or whatever it is that they're building, a zeitgeist, when they're pushing that scale of a lie, they need to they need to maintain their story, and they typically don't. They slip up here and there and they fail, and then so that's the thing that really annoys them the most, is when you point out their mistakes, you get this like leverage over what they're saying. They don't look as credible, and so they have to get you out of the way. So I mean, there's like a couple more tactics, or frivolous lawsuits, like slap suits. That's what I'm experiencing, is the frivolous lawsuit. Renouf experienced a flagpole on the head, so he got the violence end of things. Ezra Levant gets sued all the time for the things that he says, and I mean, he says a lot of stuff that's pretty bang on, and it's not like these people are seeking remedy. No, they're just looking for money so that they can fund the revolution and use the money of the people who are speaking up about it against them. So those are all a variety of tactics to be aware of. Some of the lingo keywords, and I'll just drop some keywords really fast because they're very important to know. Solidarity. Solidarity is a very bad concept because it doesn't, it indoctrinates people into showing support without actually thinking about what they're supporting. Then there's direct action. Direct action is implying that you're going to do something to stop something, and well, if there's laws that get in the way, those don't matter. It's the same thing with diversity of tactics. Well, when they're talking about diversity of tactics, they're not just talking about the lawful path towards resolving a revolution. We'll say that they've expanded that now to criminal actions, to black bloc style tactics, anarchists basically smashing up the neighborhood, and that's one of their mechanisms for fomenting revolution. And finally, one of the most nefarious components of all would be the sustainable development component, because I mean, everybody thinks that saving the environment's great, right? And it is. But if you really examine what these people are pushing, they're not pushing for individuals to be able to, who are capable of living in a closed loop system and not polluting the environment. They don't care about that at all. They care about centralized control systems and making them more pervasive. And that's because people, in their ideology, people are too stupid for their own good, and they need, you know, a nanny state to take care of them. So yeah, that's just a variety of the tactics that they use.
I'll start off by saying that I go to every protest I attend quietly, and I just stand on the sidelines and film and do my own thing. The more I did this, the more I started getting pushback. I think like you guys got in Hamilton. Those people didn't want me to be there. They didn't want me to be filming. At the May Day 2012, when I went to cover that march, they surrounded me and they tried to intimidate me to leave. In the end, I think there were 3 TV cameras on us and they backed off. A couple weeks after that, actually a few weeks after that, during the casserole protests in Toronto, which were the protests against, in solidarity for the Quebec student march, Quebec student riots, I was approached by a group of anarchists in masks in the middle of the street with police behind me, who came and grabbed my camera and tried to shove me around. I ended up walking away from that. The police let them walk away from that. Then a couple days later, I'm walking in Toronto through Kensington Market, and I got a call from someone on my phone, and I sat down and I was just writing something on the phone, when a man with a flagpole with a black anarchist flag on the end of it comes charging towards me. He says, "You call us anarcho-primitivists?" Bang! He smashes me on the head. I use the phrase anarcho-primitivist in an article. But the flagpole he smashed me with wasn't a flagpole. It was a 5/8-inch heavy wooden dowel from a closet. I still have a hole in my head today from this, and I broke a tooth. from the attack. The man who attacked me, or is alleged to have attacked me, is currently going through the court system and charged with aggravated assault. He's a Toronto anarchist named Alex Belk, who published a anarchist magazine named, I can't think of the name, he published an anarchist magazine here in Ontario. He's deeply involved and connected to the professional activists in Ontario. So he went to school with Secura Saunders' husband, who worked with Dave Vasey, who worked with the entire crowd. These were people directly connected to the people I write about. And they hospitalized me, left me with a broken tooth and 4 staples in my head.
Wow.
This is what you get when you write about and criticize. Be careful. I had another attack. You can probably find it on my website. Last June, I was filming an Indigenous protest up in North Toronto, and this one guy came up to me with his bicycle and jumped off his bike, came in running at to punch me. I pulled back and got away, and he didn't actually hit me. Standing beside me was the what do they call it? The head of the local police detachment, and he didn't arrest him. He didn't do anything. So,
what do you think's up with that? You think they want you to get punched out?
No, I think police have a hard situation here, and they're trying to not make things get worse. So when the guys with the masks came up to me the day before I was seriously assaulted, and they said, "No, let's just calm it down." And I understand their position here, because everything the anarchist protesters do is intended to make the police look bad. They're trying to get the police to trip up. So the police are having a hard job. And while I think many police officers appreciate what I do, and they love laughing at some of the things that come out and seeing the ridiculousness in the community, at the same time, I think some are a little bit, would rather there be less trouble or less issues there.
First buzzword, I guess, would be social justice. It's what all the lefties are aiming for, and really it's kind of the antithesis of justice when you consider how this is supposed to be achieved. You're holding other people to higher standards. It's kind of a very elastic term, and you could use it to mean pretty much anything, because it's really really loose in its definition. But it basically means the elimination of classes, more or less, and make everybody living at the same sort of standard of living. And this is basically the end goal of communism, to eliminate all classes. And I mean, it is fitting that it is one of their goals. And I mean, some people on the left don't see it that way, but that is the way that it's leading, and that's the way that it has typically historically led.
Now, I would describe social justice as a never-ending political crusade, which goal is to perpetually increase citizens' entitlement rights provided by the government, therefore inevitably leading to a state of communism. Now, equality can be described as anti-competition. Everyone should be treated as equal, regardless of their skill, their education, their accolades, or even their experience.
Equality is kind of something that dovetails from social justice. It's this whole idea that all cultures are somehow equal, and I mean, it's kind of used to an extreme. They kind of just make it seem like every culture is automatically going to perform equally. So if you point out when someone's not performing equally, you're labeled as a racist or a bigot or whatever. And it just really leads to anti-intellectualism, because you can't expose the truth because it becomes politically incorrect. just because the person's, you know, a certain color. Equality is used in a lot of economic propaganda as well, because they want to raise taxes on businesses and really force them out. I mean, that's what's happening with Obamacare big time. A lot of businesses can't afford it, so they're laying people off. And that's kind of and it kind of stems from that propaganda, like, oh, you know, we got to help out the working man, so we're going to raise taxes on, you know, the people that provide their paychecks. It's really it's really not very smart, but that's where this type of thinking leads to.
It starts from a false premise, which is that there's something that all cultures are equal in some undefinable sense, which has never been the case. I mean, some cultures are better at some things, worse at other things, and at particular times in history, one group's culture may be ascendant, and another time another group's. But what you almost never see is what they assume is a norm, namely all groups performing pretty much the same in all kinds of fields across the board. That you can go through centuries of history without finding a single example of that.
Multiculturalism is this kind of false premise that all cultures function equally, and I mean there is literally no example of this ever happening, but the left really pushes this idea that we need to be, you know, sensitive to everything, and it stems from the whole idea of tolerance, right? We have to be tolerant of everybody, but the kind of the backdoor, the kicker of this is we end up tolerating evil, and that kind of starts this cultural decay that we see happening, and it's all in the name of being tolerant, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. This idea of tolerance is very self-contradictory, because the whole thing is that you have to be tolerant of everybody except of people that are intolerant. So you end up being intolerant by being tolerant. So really, it's a self-refuting idea for one. But to say that everything is acceptable, you're saying that things that oppose each other are acceptable. And that just doesn't make sense, because wouldn't one of them have to be wrong? So this whole idea of we have to tolerate everything it's more anti-intellectualism from the left. They just want to use it to blackmail people and call them bigots when they don't agree with them, and say, hey, you need to make our choice, or you're not making a choice. You know, that's what the feminists like to do.
Now, the way that sustainability is used by the left is that it's a form of population control. Whether it be in the name of the environment, women's rights, or even agriculture, it's purely a eugenics agenda for population control.
Sustainability, it's this concept that we have to live in harmony with the earth, and the UN in particular really takes kind of a pantheistic worldview on this. Like the whole world is like divine, and the ground we walk on is like equal to us somehow. So we have to protect it at all costs, and you'll see this with things such as like global warming. And I mean, they've all come out and say, you know, this is actually a plan to redistribute wealth and all the rest of it. Another thing is population control, and they really don't want people having kids. I mean, there's some real extreme movements out there where they're like volunteering not to reproduce and stuff like that, and they pretty much say that human beings are scum and we're bad for the earth, so we need to go, pretty much. And yeah, you'll see this with climate change and other things with the UN, and I mean even on a local level too, like Kathleen Wynne in Ontario. And this whole idea stems in from Marxist thought, specifically materialism. This is directly derived from a materialistic worldview, that if we are chance byproducts of nature, then why is the grass we walk on held in higher regard than us? So therefore it kind of does to human beings what Marxism does to the middle class, is something I like to say. And that's really true. It makes us equal to the ground that we spit on, all in the name of making us better and more equal, you know. And it just doesn't it really doesn't turn out that way. Then you realize that I guess the grass is greener on the other side. They use the environment as kind of justification to shut down business because, you know, we're polluting or whatever. And I mean, and that's it's not good for business. I mean, it puts a huge dent in the economy, and that's bad for the working man as well. Like these people are really counterintuitive to their own goals. But it's because of their philosophy. It's totally backwards. They don't have anything right. And I mean, if anyone with half a brain could think and realize that is what's going to happen if you put all these types of caps on the people producing jobs and wealth and opportunities, then obviously there's going to be less of those. I mean, it's just common sense.
Now, what political correctness is it's censorship of criticism, especially in the terms of minorities. Many words are emotionally discredited as politically incorrect, even though the term may accurately describe the context in which the word is being utilized for.
Political correctness is kind of this concept where you can't call things what they are because they might offend people. And I mean, this happens in many different departments, actually. Main one I've noticed over the years is feminism. They're the ones that make a real big deal over how you speak and about using, you know, appropriate gender neutral pronouns and stuff like that. It just leads to more anti-intellectualism as well, because I mean I was watching, for example, a video a while ago about these geneticists that discovered that King Tut descended, or was the rather ancestor of the Europeans, and then there was these black people claiming that it was something to do with racism. And I mean that's where this type of enabling leads to, for people to just to say stuff like that. Yeah, like you can't call someone a midget, or you can't call someone fat, you know, because you might be being insensitive, but really you're just kind of using an accurate term that describes them, but they're just ashamed of it, so they call you intolerant, but really they're just kind of embarrassed about, you know, about themselves. And it's not really like they're derogatory, because I mean, like, you could have fat on your steak, right? And there's nothing derogatory about it. It's just fat. But as soon as you use it to describe a person, you know, that person's fat, then all of a sudden it becomes offensive. And the left likes to kind of play to that whole scenario there, where they just basically use the "you're being offensive" card as a way to escape debate by just using ad hominem attacks, and political correctness is probably their #1 way of doing that. They just discredit their opponents and pretty much end the debate at that. They don't actually have to have, you know, facts or valid arguments or any of that stuff. They can just emotionally blackmail you, and they think that it's enough to win.
So you look at the history of activism in the last few years. There was a resurgence in the movement against anti-globalization in the Battle of Seattle, the WTO in 1999. At this point, they were very obvious what they wanted. They were never shy. They said, we want no more corporate globalism. They say globalism. They've actually been changing their language lately. They say corporate globalism because the reality is their UN globalism is just another type of globalism. And so these all come out of the same movement. And you look at the history of the movements. The Seattle WTO started a lot of the violence and a lot of the activities there were by the Ruckus Society, who were in tides. But when the violence happened, there was a major clash between activists there in Seattle, and some were saying we can't be violent, others saying, hey, we have to allow others to be violent. The Seattle WTO was the first time really where the question in the activist community came, should we have violence? And what came out of that through the World Social Forum, which is the global organization that's leading anti-globalism movement, was that we should accept the concept of diversity of tactics. Diversity of tactics says that everyone's allowed to protest and express themselves in any way they wish. So one person may wish to block traffic, another person may wish to put up a sign, another person may wish to join the government, another person may wish to smash a window or blow up a bank, as happened in the G20. And with the doctrine of diversity of tactics, we must accept whatever people choose to do. And that became the beginning of the anti-globalization movement, and we saw that move on to protest in Quebec City at the Summit of the Americas, which I believe was '92. And the Summit of the Americas was the first in Canada. And we looked at the people involved there, was the Council of Canadians, and the same foundations and unions in Quebec City. In Quebec City were the first time we had real black bloc actions in Canada. When I was mentioning the love as a movement to people, this is an interesting thing I should have mentioned. One more person in that group of tattoos is a man who goes by the name of Velcro Ripper. Velcro Ripper did the movie Occupy Love. Velcro Ripper met Judy Rebick, a Ryerson University professor, inside of Hollyhock a few years before. And she brought him to Occupy to make the film of Occupy Love, with all the same tattoo people in them. We had Clayton Thomas Mueller and all these same professional activists. When you look into the history of the Velcro Ripper, he also made the same film for the Quebec Summit of the Americas. And he's the official filmmaker of the revolution. This led me to understand where the real revolution is coming from, which is the world, the World Social Forum. World Social Forum was started in South America. It's basically South American revolutionaries who wanted to start a global revolution. The idea of it is it's supposed to be the counter-protest to Davos, Switzerland, to the World Economic Forum. The World Social Forum in Canada, so in each country for the World Social Forum they have an organization that represents them. In Canada it's Alternatives International. Alternatives International is led by Judy Rebick, Ryerson University professor. Judy Rebick led all the people behind Occupy Vancouver, Occupy Toronto. She was the matron. She wrote the book, Occupy, what was her book called? Occupy This. And it's a global movement to fight against corporate globalization. Unifor is a brand new Canadian union. It was created by an amalgamation of the Canadian Auto Workers and the Communication, Energy and Paperwork Union. The CEP is interesting, the latter, because they, during the Quebec Summit of the Americas, there was a story that came out about some police officers being caught acting as Black Bloc. So as Black Bloc activists. They had masks on, they had rocks in their hands. But the one of the members of the CEP noticed that they all wore the same boots. And they had a little label on the bottom of the boot, and they were cops. And so they outed them as cops. So the CEP itself is very connected to this violent angle of the protest. They perhaps weren't doing the violent protest, but they helped reposition what happened during Quebec City by only pointing at the police, who were dressed as Black Bloc. But meanwhile, we had Velcro Ripper, who we were just talking about, who was filming the Black Blocs, smashing things and banging things, and it was there was a real Black Bloc going on. The other part of this, of Unifor, is the Canadian auto workers. Canadian auto workers, when you look into manipulation of Indigenous communities, they're very close with many of the people doing this. When you look at Caledonia, what happened there in Ontario when an entire town was terrorized, there were Canadian auto workers members there on the side of the protesters who were terrorizing the town.
But the weird thing was, the OPP were working with the natives. I was there. They were working with them. They wouldn't arrest the natives. They would only arrest non-natives.
Where?
Dude, like there'd be
Caledonia, you mean? Or
Caledonia.
Okay, sorry.
There'd be scraps going on. Native protesters.
They do anything they want.
They do anything they want, and the cops wouldn't arrest them. They would only arrest non-natives.
Yep.
And then that started making a lot of non-natives pissed. So like, I don't know if it was like
that's what Gary
a tactic. I don't know if it was like a tactic to like divide and conquer or what, but there was something going on, man. I'm not saying all the protesters were working with the police, but for sure, like the head top, like they were communicating, man. They not at first. There was some like the cops did raid them and all this other stuff, but it seems like afterwards they started like kind of collaborating on like two-tier justice.
Well, definitely, and I think what Gary McHale did there was rather, I think his tactics were maybe rough on the edges, but it was very important.
Yeah.
And he proved it outright. But the reason all that happened was because of Ipperwash before.
Yeah.
Right. Dudley George got shot during Ipperwash, and a paper was written about how we can better deal with Indigenous protesters.
Yeah.
And then that affected what happened at Caledonia.
Yeah.
Now, if you don't think that those are connected, you're a fool, because who wrote the paper to tell the government how to better deal with Indigenous protesters? James Sakai Ward. He's a professor at University of Victoria who is currently, next month, in April, will be leading the training of people against the pipelines. So he's the guy who wrote the Ipperwash, part of the Ipperwash reports. And the Ipperwash reports weakened the ability to come for the police to do anything. Caledonia comes and the OPP are completely toothless. But just recently this has started changing. You saw the blockade between Montreal and Ottawa of the Via Rail line.
I heard about that like not too long ago, right?
It was 2 weeks ago?
2 weeks, yeah.
And that was led by radicals, the same crowd. A guy from OCAP was one of them. But they lasted not very long, and they were arrested and taken in and charged. So it's the first time that the government's been coming back and actually reacting properly. I cannot, in all my research, I cannot agree the fact that the government is making this happen. I honestly think it's absolutely within possibility. But there's
Divide and conquer.
But there's no evidence of that, A. And B, these people are fighting against our government. They are absolutely fighting against our government. The social forum that'll be happening in Ottawa this summer, the entire stated goal of it is to fight Harper and oil sands. I think they want to use Canada as one of the first examples of how to implement this globalist, socialist, mixed state. And Canada is a very good place for that because we have immigration culture. So we already have, we're one of the first countries to go hardcore and to focus on multiculturalism.
Yeah.
And that didn't necessarily work well. We're a little bit far behind, but I lived in the Netherlands where they had multiculturalism pushed. And they're killing each other. It tore society apart at the center. But Canada is the ultimate place to make these changes because A, we have this multicultural society, B, we have all these resources and land and value, and C, we have how many people? 38 million?
Yeah.
We can't even control ourselves. There are so few of us. And all it takes is a few American billionaires to fund to change Canadian policy. And they're more powerful than Americans. So than Canadians, I mean. So think about when Ellen DeGeneres stands up and says we must stop seal hunting. How many Canadians does she have the power over when she does that? She earned $2.1 million to fight seal hunting while she did it. How many Canadians put that much money into keeping seal hunting? Because we're losing our power. And I don't see our Canadian government participating with these people. It's absolutely possible. Anything could be true. We could wake up one day, but there are two sides I see. Our Canadian government is on the globalist corporate side, and I see their side is on the globalist UN side. So we're talking about the CIW and Kevin Annett. Kevin Annett is a defrocked United Church clergy who was thrown out after making some crazy accusations about the church, that they were covering things up at the exact same time that the church was actually disclosing. But there were many problems with Annett. He had social issues within the church. He was creating friction and they wanted to get rid of him. As soon as he left, he started claiming that he knew of mass graves of children across the country. There were 50,000 residential school children murdered. The Canadian government this week just released 5,000 dead residential school student names. There may be 10 even, but 50 is a number that's out of this world. But he was being used to attack the United Church. I don't know who was using him, but as soon as he left the United Church, he was hired by the Canadian Auto Workers, and his job was to help recruit the United Church clergy into the Canadian Auto Workers. This is something that was only successful last month, I believe, when the United Church clergy joined Unifor. Kevin Annett then he came to Ontario in 2011 during Occupy, at which point he went to the Six Nations Reserve in Brantford, Ontario, and he went to the Mohawk Residential School, where he claimed to have found a mass grave of children's bones. He picked up bones and showed them around, and he carried the bones in his pockets, and he pulled them out at presentations. I have the bones of children! Standing beside him was a CAW person. Promoting Kevin Annett was Rabble.ca, which has received CAW funding, and the Media Co-op. There's a lot of lines that draw towards Kevin Annett and the unions, particularly the CAW. In the end, we disproved his lie about a mass grave. It wasn't true.
Yeah, and the bones, didn't Ryan Elson call up the lab that he claimed to have tested the bones at, and then the lab even said that they don't know who Kevin Annett is?
Well, what happened was, at first I brought up the question to Kevin Annett. I said, where's the DNA test? And he said, well, we haven't got it yet. It takes a lot of money, it takes time. So I made a phone call to the US company that does DNA tests. I said, how much does it cost? How long does it take? He said, $500, 7 days or your money back. So Annett says, okay, but I sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution, and they're taking care of them. So a writer named Heather Martin, based out of Saskatchewan, she runs a website called Stop Kevin Annett. She went and contacted and communicated with the Smithsonian and said, do you have any records of bones? And they said, no. And they said, well, what about the guy who Kevin said he gave the bones to? Oh, he's dead. Of course, Kevin Annett's first thing is to say, look, they killed him. But Kevin Annett has a habit of testimony from dead people. So this dead person said this dead person said that. In 2012, I exposed Kevin Annett taking the signature of a dead woman and photocopying it on top of a letter and saying it was from her. So he's constantly making up these stories. But so Unifor is a militant union. The first person at Unifor to speak at their opening ceremonies was Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein is a writer and anti-globalist, and one of the leaders of this collectivist movement, as you call it. I met Naomi Klein first at Occupy Vancouver when she was marching with Harsha Walia to protest the building of condos downtown. It's a very intertwined world. Unifor calls itself a militant union. And the most important thing about that we need to ask is, what do they mean? Because the union movement started back in the 1800s in Chicago at the Haymarket Affair, where someone took and threw Molotov cocktails at police and people and there were deaths. That's what union militancy is. Today, they don't, and they refuse to explain what they mean by militancy, but we look at their connections and who they're working with, and working with the anarchists and the radicals, and Unifor scares me. Sid Ryan is the only union leader who ever told me to fuck off. Sid Ryan is the head of the Ontario Federation of Labour. He's an Irishman who came to Canada later in life. This is something I think you guys want to keep an eye out when you're researching this. A lot of people come from outside of Canada who are leading this. Judy Rebick, who's leading the anti-globalization movement in Canada, is an American. Go down the list, but we have Americans and British. The guy who leads OCAP is British. If you look at the scandal in BC last week of the Activist Housing Association, Portland Housing, led by a British person. We have a lot of American imports. I even believe Libby Davies from the NDP is an American.
Well, even if you go to even the offshoots, Lead Now, Matthew Carroll, British.
British. Well, Lead Now is also an interesting information organization, because Lead Now was based upon the American organization. I'm trying to remember their name. Move On.
Yeah.
Yeah. So leadnow.org, leadnow.ca is a Canadian NGO. It's a non-profit, not a charity, so they have the right to be political. They're based upon the American movement called MoveOn.org, which was started to back Clinton back in the 90s. It was to bring political activism and to bring voters together. When you look at Lead Now, who was on their board of directors but Judy Rebick? Judy Rebick, who's on the board of directors of Alternatives Canada, which leads the World Social Forum's representation in Canada. Judy Rebick was leading Occupy. And Judy Rebick's crowd, who's involved with Idle No More. This is an important thing I didn't bring up about Idle No More. Idle No More's money, we've discovered, comes through, first of all, a fundraising organization that raises money for politicians. And the same fundraising organization raised money for the Neo Young tour. That was all going through them. And they lead for all through the Love is the Movement crowd. But also Olivia Chow, they run her fundraising. And in Vancouver, we mentioned earlier in our interview, the BC Civil Liberties Association, the former head of the BC Civil Liberties Association, who during the 2010 Olympics withdrew his legal observers the day the violence came, so that they couldn't act as witnesses against the protesters. He's also funded through the same group. So we're looking at Lead Now connection to this. Lead Now in 2012, they were leading an initiative which was against the robocall scandal. The head of Lead Now spoke in Vancouver, and he said, "We need to have new election now, and we need to turn and overthrow our government right now." I spoke to him a couple days later, and he apologized to me, and he said, even my funders said I was a little bit overboard. But what did we see with Lead Now with Matthew Carroll here in Toronto? The same protests. And we had a person who came from the Egyptian Revolution who said that we must have a new world order.
The people are writing a new world order.
I don't know what he means by new world order or not. We can interpret that different ways, but there's a connection here also, is that he came from the Egyptian Revolution. In Toronto, we have an anarchist protester, a professional protester named Sakura Saunders, who is one of the leaders of Occupy Toronto. During Occupy Toronto, Sakura Saunders was standing and broadcasting live from the media center of the Egyptian Revolution. We start putting these things together, and we start finding the same groups and the same organizations and the same connections. It's part of a global movement, and there's no question about that. So the question we really should ask about the politicians who are working in this global movement is, who are they representing? Canada or a global movement? Sid Ryan's an Irishman who came to Canada. I don't know his exact history, but he became the leader of CUPE, Ontario, and now he's a leader of the Ontario Federation of Labour, which is the organizing group between the unions across the country. Sid Ryan is a die-hard NDP supporter. Even when you look at our current Premier, Kathleen Wynne, who is very much to the left, much more to the left than your typical liberal. He still won't support her because he's very strong on NDP. But Sid Ryan and the Ontario Federation of Labour, their main job is creating the political side of the unions. And so they're part of the revolutionary groups. I guess the best example I can give about their involvement comes from the Sammy Yatim shooting. So last summer there was a kid in Toronto who was shot dead on a streetcar named Sammy Yatim. The video came out and the video looked questionable because the cop was standing a few feet away and he shot the kid. The truth and the reality of the situation is that we will never know what happened. You never know what was going through that cop's mind or where he was. Was he irresponsible? Was he not irresponsible? We don't know. But as soon as Yatim was shot, there were protests set. And the family of Yatim set up here at Dundas Square down the road, their first protest. All of a sudden, No One Is Illegal came in, which is this anarchist organization that leads most of the protests in Toronto. When No One Is Illegal came into the protest, they immediately tried to steer the family into their own protest. So the two girls who were the sisters or family members who were leading it started marching down Yonge Street on the sidewalk. And then the No One Is Illegal people came and said, no, come on the street, follow us. And No One Is Illegal filled the protest with their own people. And it turned out less of a memorial to Sammy Yatim and more of a fuck the police march, as it became. The first stop they made was at 52 Division of the Toronto Police, where they rushed the doors of the protest and the police station and tried to break in. Right after that happened, these sisters, or the family members of Sammy Yatim, stood up and said, "This is not what this is about. We're not against the police," which was the first indication of the split. The second Sammy Yatim protest came a couple weeks later. But before the protest happened, what do you find but the family of Sammy Yatim at a press conference with Sid Ryan and the Ontario Federation of Labour. It's once again how the activists work for the unions, for the NDP, because Sid Ryan is really the NDP. The activists go and pull in the protest and turn it into a circus. Then they pulled the family in, and the unions brought the family and said, "We're helping you, family." And then it turned into a very large fuck the police march. So when I look at Sid Ryan and the Ontario Federation of Labour's involvement in this, it's very deep. And they're the activist angle. They're funding and organizing a lot of the activists in the city. The Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, OCAP, is directly supported by Sid Ryan and by the Ontario Federation of Labour.
Hey everybody, we are Frankie, Lucas, and Terry from the Canadian Awareness Network. On March 15th, there was an International Day Against Police Brutality protest in Hamilton. It was the first year that Hamilton has held one of these annual events, so we went out to cover it. When we first arrived, it was 7 p.m., and the protesters had gathered at the McNabb bus station. The majority of them wearing all black, faces covered, doing their usual protest things. Now, Frank and Lucas here went into the crowd to try to interview some people while I sat back and just shot some footage. So I'll let these guys talk to you about what they experienced when they went into the crowd to try to do an interview, which we've done at many other protests and rallies before.
Well, pretty much saw Warren Francis. He was handing out flyers, so told him to give me some, so I can hand out flyers, get to know people or whatever. And then I was planning on asking them, what are some solutions to end police brutality? That's all I wanted to do. And also I wouldn't have minded somebody consenting to an interview where they were like, I wanted to be like, hey, why are you here today? What's this protest about? And what are some solutions to police brutality? That was my main goal, but nothing else. And what happened was we got
First I was chilling behind you with the camera, and basically filming you hand out those pamphlets and educate people on the information within the pamphlets. And then we were approached by one of the people that we had a past confrontation with from the Occupy movement. And this was an individual that I previously had quite an interaction with. I was pushed into a horse during, I was pushed almost into a horse, sorry, a police horse, by one of these protesters. And he came up to me and Frankie and told us that we don't want you here. You're not welcome, right?
Yeah, and then he went on to call me a snitch, that we're collaborating with the police, because at another anti-police rally that I attended in 2013, I went with the camera. It was me and Heather, and I was trying to do the same thing, but that day I was actually kind of semi-able to do a good video. But I went up and all I asked the guys, I'm like, I got nothing against people wearing masks. I mean, I defend the right to remain anonymous if you want to put a face mask on, whatever. I got nothing against that. But I was just asking the question. I was just asking, why are you wearing a mask? That's all. Like, I wasn't bashing them. Like, my question.
It was just a question.
It was just a question. So I don't know. Anyway, so he's saying that, you know, we tried to demask them. And he's saying that by us filming them or whatever, we're putting people at danger, even though there was hundreds of people videotaping it.
Even people there that weren't there for it, they were just seeing it on the street, pulled out their cell phones.
Yeah.
And we're recording it.
And you know, this guy went into delusions. He's like, oh, it has escalated a lot between us. And I'm like, I have no idea what he's talking about, because like, that was the first time, or like, you know, that was actually the second time I ever had a confrontation with him.
All right, so while we're having this conversation with this individual, we tried to explain, well, me and Frankie tried to explain to him that we both have, well, all three of us have a mutual goal to make the city a safer place in regards to police activity. We told the guy that, you know, we do have differing views. We have had conflicting behaviors in the past, but that we're willing to put that behind us in order to make progress in the city. And he was unwilling to do that. He just kept dismissing whatever we had to say, and ultimately didn't want to you know, work with us in any way to help make changes. We told him about the police meetings. I told him that, you know, there's police meetings every month. If you want to help make change, instead of doing these protests all the time, why don't you come and bring the people that are in these protests to the police meetings, right?
So basically, you know, they didn't have any solutions, the whole crowd. All they wanted to do was walk around and, you know, shout.
Yeah, it's like after you guys talked to them, how it ended, wasn't it? Another woman just came in and told you to shut the F up.
Oh yeah.
Just shut the F up. Shut the F up.
Oh yeah, I got yelled at. Yeah, I got yelled at, and you know, while I'm trying to make amends with them, while I'm saying, hey, whatever. Anyway, and then after that, they were doing creative stuff. They had some people playing drums, but when they got to the police station, I did not agree with what they were doing. They were advocating violence against the police. The one guy was yelling stuff like,
you're gonna get shot in the face.
Yeah, like straight up telling the cops this.
Like to their face.
To their face. And, you know, saying, hey, if you don't change your ways, the people are gonna rise up in violent ways.
No reason to kill us anymore. Andreas Tenor over you guys are fucking murderers. You're dirt. You're not worth my fucking respect. Shame, shame, shame. Woo! You will change. You will change. You will change. This is Canada. Your days are running. Woo!
Is that what he said? Can't hear what he's saying right now? He's saying
no, I did not check the film.
There will be a day when people will take their life for being phony police officer. You serve and protect the people. No. You serve and protect money. You gotta get rid of Ryan Tosha. He's a cancer amongst you. And we know it, and you know it.
Like, okay, Terry and I, we go to these police board meetings, and they straight up say they expect riots. And Terry and I are like, why would they? Now I know why they expect riots, because of these types of people going up to the police saying stupid things like that.
And they had no message during the whole protest. It was cops, pigs, murderers, F the police.
Whose streets are streets?
Whose streets are streets. No information was being handed out. They weren't interacting with the public. I saw people coming out of restaurants and seeing it on the street. And they were just disgusted by it. There was families in restaurants.
Yeah.
While these guys are going by, F the police, F the police. Get those animals off those horses. It was nothing but an agitation event. Agitating the police, agitating the community.
Like we picked up the slack a bit, right? As they were gathering all the attention of making music and doing their yelling stuff, while the people came out, at least, you know, once in a while I went up to these people and I told them what's going on. You know, 1 minute statement, just so they know why people are walking down the street.
I think the most telling thing about the protest for myself was that a lot of these groups consider themselves like unity. You know, the collective. We don't leave anybody behind. We're all one big group. Well, when the cops chased down one of the protesters for lighting off a firework, detained him, they all came. I was the first one to go over. They slowly came over, a small group of them. And within a couple minutes, after the police told the rest of the protesters, oh, he's just getting a fine, they all left. And left that person still detained by the police. So, but if you see them online, talking about these things, or in forums talking about these things, they are there till the end. They're there to support each one of each other.
Yeah, they were all gone. They
were all gone. It was actually us with the cameras who stuck around.
Yeah,
to make sure there was no police brutality.
So when they were threatening the cops with violence, what was the police response to them?
The police stayed quiet. They stood their
They
ground.
took it. They didn't even charge the guy or nothing, but for whatever reason they decided to ticket the one guy because they were shooting fireworks at the building, and I'm not sure if you caught that on film or not.
I'm not sure either. I have to review the film. But yeah, they ticketed a man for shooting off fireworks.
But they wouldn't.
And they did nothing about the guy threatening them with violence right in front of their faces.
Hey Terry, what's the weird thing that guy shouted that you caught on camera? That he's like an illegal immigrant or something.
Oh yeah, at the end, you might like this part.
Drunk because alcohol is legal, but more destructive than anything else. You know what's legal? Me being here without being a citizen. That can still pass a law like a not get charged. I fucking love Canada.
Hamilton recently became Canada's second sanctuary city for illegal immigrants, or as they like to call them, undocumented
So what's
workers.
that? What's that mean though?
Basically, that any city services are not going to ask anybody what their immigration status is. If an illegal immigrant calls the Hamilton police, the police are not going to ask him about his immigration status. In essence, not enforcing Canadian law. They're allowing illegal immigrants to stay without question. So anyways, at the end of it, the one guy yelled out, man, I effing love Canada. I'm not here legally. I can do whatever I want. I can yell at the police, and I get to go and have a beer. Wasn't it? It was like basically,
yeah. Straight up.
He was happy at their inaction. He was enthused by it. You know, I love this country for the things that are destroying it. It was incredible.
So basically, these people, like they personally know us. They don't like us, and you know, I have spoken with them about their political ideologies and stuff like that, and they absolutely believe in their hearts that the only way to bring in change is to be a radical and to promote violence. Like in their minds, you know, they do want change, just like all of us do, but in their minds they truly believe they have to be violent to achieve that. And that's where we differ, and that's where they don't like us.
It's a violent-based ideology with violent-based protests.
Yeah.
Amanda Hiscox is an anarchist activist here based in Toronto. During the G20, just before the violence happened, she and Alex Hundred were arrested. They were both thought to be the main ringleaders for the G20. They were arrested before there were any protests because they were both training activists how to de-arrest their colleagues, so how to take violent protest against the police. And they were, Alex and others had handed out a list of potential places to smash, I think. So I think the gist of the list, the meaning of the list was, don't smash an individual's store, but smash Starbucks. But they were both arrested and charged before the violence occurred. And then when the violence happened, they arrested more people. A number of, a couple dozen, I think, were arrested altogether and charged. Most people who were arrested were just released. Hiscox, when she was convicted, I think she was given 16 months. When Amanda Hiscox was arrested, she had zero sense of remorse. When she was charged and went through courts, she was adamant that what she was doing was the right thing to change the world. Amanda Hiscox was the person who the Toronto Star wrote about and called a activist hero for helping handicapped fellow prisoners. So she has a lot of support from the community. The minute, actually, a week before Amanda Hiscox was released from prison, it was announced that she was being hired by the Ontario Public Interest Research Group, OPIRG, which is a major source of power for the activist community in Ontario. In York University's OPIRG, they fund No One Is Illegal, and they fund the Maoist organizations, and they fund all the revolutionary groups. But the OPIRG organizations are funded by university student fees. They're called opt-out in many universities, like York University. So there the students can choose to opt out of paying their OPIRG fee for a period of 1 week a year. So if you ever watched Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, remember when they're about to smash down his house? And they said, but I didn't see a permit. Well, yes, but there was a permit. It was downstairs in the sub basement. I got it protected by a tiger. It's the same thing with OPIRG. They make it so hard to actually get out of the information, so to get out of the payment, that most people just pay it. OPIRG is extremely anti-Israel organization, which is, if you're pro or anti-Israel, either way, you have to realize that not all University of Toronto students are anti-Israel. But in reality, or York or the other universities, the reality is that they're paying for anti-Israel protests. The reality is they're paying for socialist protests. The reality is they're paying for the Maoists to go marching around and interrupt men's rights groups' meetings. All these groups are funded by OPIRG. So Amanda Hiscox was immediately hired by OPIRG right afterwards.
Wow.
Now, the same OPIRG that Amanda Hiscox was hired by, I wish I could remember the name of the university, but the same OPIRG that Amanda Hiscox was hired by, the person who bailed out the anarchist who hospitalized me in June 2012 also worked with OPIRG. So we find these organizations very close to the anarchist community, and Hiscox is being supported by the OPIRGs. It's basically this radical, unrepentant, criminal anarchist who was released for jail was immediately given a job paid for by university students.
I'll start with saying thank you for the invite. I'm still really shocked that people invite me to things like this. It's kind of weird for me, it's new. And I guess I will sort of repeat what Dylan said, just to say that the things I'm going to be talking about, like what's happened to me for the last few years, has been a little intense. But at the same time, I don't feel like it has made me any more afraid. I feel like I'm more committed. And I think it's important for everyone to know that, we are really resilient as people, and we can take a lot. And we can take a lot more than sometimes we think that we can. So I certainly don't want to deter anyone from taking risks and from doing what needs to be done with anything that I'm saying today. So I want to start off with that. I really see the value of organizing around summits and of bringing so many people together on the streets and having so much strength in numbers and standing up to the police and just feeling the power that you can have when you're that committed. You can keep each other safe. I think it's a really great way to organize and really inspiring, and I was really glad to be a part of that. So I was part of the Toronto Community Mobilization Network, and I was part of the action committee of that group. And I want to just take a second to talk about one really important thing that we had decided to endorse as a network, and that is the idea of diversity of tactics. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, basically that means that whether or not you agree with a certain tactic that people might use, you don't shit talk to the media, and you don't snitch to the cops on those people, regardless of how you personally feel about this tactic. And we had decided to do that because basically, you know, we don't know, none of us know where people are coming from, and none of us know the experiences that they have and the reasons that they choose to speak truth to power in a certain way. And none of us are in a position to judge the people for the choices that they make. And so it was really important to us, if we're going to have a mass movement, that we can be inclusive to everyone. So the Toronto Community Mobilization Network's Action Committee, we were supposed to be making sure that people could engage in a diversity of tactics, but safely. So the idea being that, you know, if there is a nonviolent, child-friendly demonstration that's been called for this corner at this time, there can't be a confrontational direct action that's also been called for that corner at that time. Our own backgrounds and just from like knowing what happens around the world at these summits, that shit's gonna go down, right? Like people don't all wanna go to a union march, they don't all wanna go in a circle and like stay in the protest pen. People are gonna wanna break stuff, they're gonna like wanna dress all in black, and they're gonna wanna light some fires, and they're gonna do that, right? So we were organizing the Get Off the Fence March, and the police did not like that either. 15 minutes is really short. So, okay, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about what actually happened. So on the morning of June 26th, it was about 4:30 in the morning, because in true anarchist style, like the big day's coming up, you know, we wouldn't be in bed or anything, we'd be like last minute organizing, of course. So we're still awake. There's this bang on the door, and we're kind of like, what? Everything goes slow motion. There's another bang on the door, and all these cops come crashing through the door. We didn't know they were cops at first, because we're like, what's happening? And then this one cop comes to the door, and he's got this gun drawn. And he's like, you know, swooping around the room with his gun, and people are yelling, like, get down on the ground, hands above your head, and all this stuff. And like, what I remember is that I wasn't scared, and I think that maybe I was in shock at that point, but I have this like sneaking suspicion that actually it's because I knew full well that those cops were not going to fire on us. Like, middle-class, white activists, absolutely no chance that we were in actual danger, and that's like really an important thing to think about. Okay, so for me, the fallout from my arrest was that I was charged with 3 counts of criminal conspiracy, so conspiracy to commit mischief, which is hilarious, it makes me sound like a leprechaun, like mischief. Conspiracy to obstruct police and conspiracy to assault police. And conspiracy is this weird thing because you don't actually have to do anything, you just have to talk about it, and you can be guilty of it. So it's nebulous, legally speaking. Sadly, we never got to figure out how the evidence actually works because we didn't end up going to trial, which I regret sometimes a lot. So conspiracy is not used that much against activists anymore. It was originally put in place during the Winnipeg General Strike, and then people were like, whoa, conspiracy, like that is a sketchy thing. Like, it's not really like a law that should be used. And so, conveniently, drug trafficking and terrorism are charges that disproportionately are laid against people of color. So I was held in jail for a month while I was waiting to be released on bail, which was 140 grand. I had full house arrest. I couldn't have any involvement in protests. I couldn't have any association with my 16 co-accused. I couldn't use anything wireless, which is weird. So that lasted for 9 months. Then my conditions were like loosened a little bit. And then in the fall of 2011, we went into preliminary inquiry. And while we were in that process, we were offered a deal by the Crown and after like weeks of really grueling, terrible conversation and discussion, we decided to negotiate it and take it. So then I was sentenced. I was sentenced to 16 months in jail, and because of the way it works in Canada, you do 2/3 of your sentence, so I got out in just under 11. And I have 3 things to say about jail. I'll make them quick. So if you ever want to see who are the most marginalized people in this country, in this society, spend some time in jail. Like, the people in jail are the people that are taking the brunt of all the things that we're fighting against. They're the people that are living with these consequences of the stuff that as social justice organizers are the things that we're taking on. Also, you'll know that there's a lot of things that a privileged person can do in jail. And a jail sentence doesn't really mean that you have to stop organizing. It just means that you organize in a different context. And so I kind of jokingly, but not really jokingly, recommend that we have like one organizer on every range at all times. Because there's a lot that you can do. And the last thing is just that a healthy person with a supportive community can survive jail, even thrive in jail. It's not as hard as it seems. And so when people are thinking about the kinds of actions that you want to engage in, you know, like make realistic decisions, but also, you know, think about what you're able to give up and know that you're tougher than you probably think that you are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about criminalization of dissent and how that happens. So in our case, a few things were really overblown. A lot of it was really overblown. So a lot of us were arrested by guns and gangs. So this was like a heavily armed, really aggressive police unit with really aggressive prosecutors. Shortly after our arrest, we found out that we'd been infiltrated by 2 undercover cops for about 1.5 years, and one of them was from the anti-terrorism unit of the OPP. We were brought to court on the first day, and we were taken to this special conspiracy court where every single person was in this individual locked box. And then during my bail hearing, I was told that I was worse than the most heinous murderer, for reals, by the Justice of the Peace. The wireless condition, like the not having any wireless devices, apparently is because if something can receive a signal, it can be used to make an explosive, which I don't know how to do that. None of us had charges of explosives. And then during a preliminary inquiry, there was this extra security station. So you come into the courthouse, you go through security, and then just in case you picked up your gun on the way from that security to the room, then there's another security on the way into the room. So they just did all these things to make us seem like really scary, which we really weren't. So we get in this situation where at one end of the spectrum, people are like, you know, like getting down on people and denouncing property destruction and people who will physically defend themselves against the police. On the other end of the spectrum, people are mocking people who want to like put out petitions and go to rallies that aren't confrontational. And so we have these divides, and it's not useful. Cops love that, that's what they want. So we need to make sure that we don't buy into that. And lastly, I think they do this stuff because they want to send a message that if you protest in certain ways, the state can hurt you. And it's really important that we send a message back, which is that we're not afraid of that. Like, you can't really hurt us that badly. And we're going to stand together, and we're going to stand in solidarity. Like, why do we need to keep going in the face of this kind of repression? And I think that, you know, I guess I'll end on this. If that's a question that we're asking ourselves, then we really need to check our privilege. And if organizing is a choice for us, then we are the people with the largest responsibility to keep organizing. Because if it's a choice for us, it means that we're the ones benefiting from the system that's currently in place. And it means that we have resources that make any consequences less severe for us than they'll be for other people. And so we got to be willing to give things up.
Dylan Powell wrote an article about me a couple months ago, 3 or 4 months ago, and he was me and Gary McHale. He tried to put us together as the same type of people, which I don't have any disagreements with Gary McHale, but it was obviously an option, a way of trying to take all the negativity towards McHale and put it towards me. But I think it's very interesting what's happening at Marineland, because it gives us a picture of how politicians fit into anarchy. The Marineland activists mainly, well, they're almost all, the leaders of this are the anarchists who are leading everything else around. One of the main participants in Toronto is Zach Crowder. Zach Crowder is a Toronto anarchist, and he's always fighting the police. He's very well known for making a spectacle out of himself. But when you look at all the action of the activism around Marineland, and then there's a politician. So Marineland is like a two-pronged approach here. We have the activists who are all protesting, and we look at the connections between these activists and politicians. Peggy Nash, who is the NDP MP for Toronto Parkdale, leads the governmental approach of attacking Marineland. So we have the activists come out and they go, oh, Marineland is bad, and then Peggy Nash stands up and goes, we need to fight Marineland. Look at all those people who are fighting Marineland. We see the same sort of things happening, very close connections with the anarchists and the activists and politicians in Toronto often. We had the attack against Toronto. There's GE Hitachi in Toronto owns a plant which creates pellets for nuclear power plants. It's right downtown. It's just about a couple kilometers down the road from us. Honestly, it's insane that we are making nuclear materials in the city, but I think it's an old legacy plant. But when the protest started, we saw Zach Crowder, who we see at the Marineland, and we saw the same group of activists go and start protesting this plant. And then all of a sudden they're standing next to the politicians of the city, of Andrew Cash of the NDP. They're standing up with the anarchists, saying, I need to save the community. I'm constantly seeing these connections of anarchists and activists who are creating situations that benefit politicians. There's another one right now in Toronto. It's the transit, I can't think of the name of it, TTC Riders, it's called. And TTC Riders is pushing an agenda of no subway to Mississauga, that we need to have an LRT instead. Curiously, the person running for government right now, running for the mayor, is Olivia Chow, former NDP MP. She's pushing for no subway but LRT. So who's running this TTC Riders? We look and it's one of the people from the Ruckus Society. One of the main trainers from the Ruckus Society, who wrote one of the manuals for the Ruckus Society, is leading the TTC Riders movement and is funded by the unions. So when we look at, this is actually the bigger picture of what activism is. We look at Olivia Chow. When they mention that she's a politician, they also say she's an activist. When you look at Olivia Chow's seat now, it's she's vacated her seat, and there's going to be a by-election. And the person they've put in place is a man named Joe Cressy. Joe Cressy is a close friend and family member of, not family member, but close to the family of Olivia Chow and her husband Jack Layton. They've been close for years. Well, just a very few years ago, there was an invasion of Parliament. A group of young activists went and interfered with Jack Layton speaking and said, Jack, why aren't you doing enough on climate change? Who was a spokesperson for these people once they got to the media after they got pulled out? Joe Cressy. Who was arrested? Dave Vasey with the Love is a Movement tattoo. Chelsea Fluke with the Love is a Movement tattoo. It's the same group of people. So here we have to ask the question, did these people go to embarrass Jack Layton because he's not doing enough on climate change? I don't think so. Jack Layton's purpose is to push the climate change agenda. We all knew this. They went in there to show the rest of the world that Jack Layton had the support of these activists to push for it. You need to push your agenda more.
Have a good one.
To go and to protest Jack Layton against climate change would be like going to protest Stephen Harper about oil sands. Stephen Harper, you're not doing enough about oil sands. It's ridiculous, right? So the activists, they set the stage, and they created a situation that the politicians work off of. And this is the activist end of the NDP. And this is the same people with Occupy, and it's the same people with I Don't Know More. And it's the same people with every major anti-globalization movement that's happened in Canada in the last 10 years.
First person I wanted to discuss is Larry Wartell. And Larry Wartell is a self-admitted communist. Basically, he is heavily connected with the unions. He promotes their materials quite heavily. He's a friend of Cuba. From what I understand, he thinks that the Cuban system is actually a good system to live under, and he runs this thing called the Social Environmental Alliance here in Victoria, which has deep connections with a variety of organizations, specifically CLC tied unions, and he also has deep connections with the anarchists. And we've got proof that not only does he have ties with the anarchist community, and he's actually seems to be one of the higher ups, one of the handlers, we'll say, or a mentor. We'll say a mentor, because like there is a bit of a hierarchy involved, and the way that it works is they refer to themselves as the collective. That's always a dead giveaway of who these people are.
I always wanted to think, just not enough guillotines. Why can't we hire experts to figure out what decision we want to make about the economy? Corporations have no crystal ball or super expertise. So what we'd have to do is we'd have to establish democratic institutions in society to plan and manage our social economy. We'd have to have planning boards at local levels, regional levels, national, continental, international levels. These would have to include whole communities, consumers, farmers, workers, everyone, not just technicians, not just any single group. We have computers. Larry Schmidt said that by 2020 the whole world will be on a computer. So why couldn't we register these kinds of votes instantaneously? Why can't we have a free discussion? Debates about positions pro and con, for cars, against cars. Have a discussion and have a vote on these things. Obviously, many issues can be decided at local levels. Others, like closing down the coal industry or repurposing the auto industry, require larger scale planning. Global warming, ocean acidification, deforestation, these require extensive international cooperation and really affect global planning. That's manageable, and we have the UN Climate Convention, which meets annually, as I mentioned, and is supposed to be charged with regulating global greenhouse gas emissions, but it doesn't have any enforcement power. Well, it needs some enforcement power. It needs to be able to say to American auto producers, no, you can't produce these big things, you're killing the planet. Figure it out. Make small cars or don't make cars, so you can't do that anymore. So you need to have different levels of democracy and delegated authority with right of recall for higher levels for representation. This can be worked out. I mean, I spent a little time in one paper about the planning commissions for public utilities in the United States, which are quite interesting because even though public utilities are both a mix of publicly owned and privately owned, mostly privately owned, nonetheless, the actual regulating process is deciding how much electricity is produced, how much water, and these other kinds of utilities get built in the United States. It's actually done through public utilities, which are entirely astonishingly democratic and open, and anybody can go to these meetings and participate and get all the records and everything. It's a kind of a big loophole they left open, but it exists. It's very interesting. Look at Greg Palast's book, P-A-L-A-S-T. He's a very good journalist. A study of public relations called Democracy. I forget the title. Democracy. It's a footnote in my book, but there's more than footnotes. A couple pages discussion of it. It's a very good example of what I would call kind of proto-socialism. And I don't see any reason why that model couldn't be extended to much of the industrial structure in America. Okay. But I was just going to say though that when scientists say, like when James Hansen and other scientists say that we need to have we need to hold CO2 emissions to 350 parts per million over the planet, isn't that in effect calling for essentially kind of a one world government on that, you know, like global responsibility, taking responsibility for the planet. That's kind of what we have to do. That's the, you know, the Anthropocene part. You know, we do need to do that. Okay? Fifth point. Democracy can only work in the context of rough socioeconomic equality. When, in the midst of the Great Depression, the great Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, who's called the people's jurist, Louis Brandeis said, we can either have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. He was more right than he thought. Than he knew. Today we have by far the greatest concentration of wealth in history. So it's hardly surprising that we have the weakest and most corrupt democratic governments since the Gilded Age. If we want democracy, we would have to abolish the great wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. That means abolishing not just private property and the major means of production, but also extremes of income, exorbitant salaries, great property, and inheritance. Because at the end of the day, the only way to prevent corruption in democracy is to make it impossible for people to materially gain by being corrupt, which means by creating a society with neither rich nor poor, a society of basic economic equality in which we're kind of all in the middle economically. And so there's no way to get rich. I think that's the only answer. I think in my view, there's an intrinsic connection between planning and democracy and equality. I just don't think you can have a true democracy without equality. I mean, look at our country. Look at this country. You know, look at our country. It's just ghastly. Just
So the Toronto Star is a rather center-left newspaper based in Toronto. It's the main daily newspaper. The Toronto Star is very, everyone in Toronto knows it is very politically leaning to the left. During the G20, the Toronto Star started writing articles promoting the people arrested for the violence as heroes. One of my favorite moments, they had a picture of them all sitting together looking all lovable and wonderful. And the writers in the Toronto Star, even after the G20, still promoted the G20 anarchists as heroes. One of my favorite stories, which actually started a war with myself and a writer for the Toronto Star, Antonia Zabaisis, she wrote that one of the G20 criminals who was in prison at the time, unrepentantly for smashing up the city and encouraging and training young people to de-arrest fellow activists. The Toronto Star writer Zabaisis presented her as a hero for her prison activism, for saying that someone in a wheelchair couldn't get up to the second level to visit their friend inside the cell block. And you look at another writer for the Toronto Star, they wrote about Alex Hundred. Alex Hundred was the main ringleader behind the violence at the G20. He was one of the trainers who was arrested and later given 18 months in prison. His first week in jail, he notices you can't get a library book at the Toronto West Detention Center. So the Toronto Star writes a story saying Alex Hundred is campaigning for the rights of his fellow prisoners to have library books. So it's great that Alex Hundred is campaigning for library books. Should prisoners have books? Absolutely. But the Toronto Star, what they were doing is they're repositioning him. They're making him as a hero activist. They didn't criticize these people. They criticized the police, which was rightful, because what the police did on the 26th, after the violence, was reprehensible. Mass arrests was absolutely wrong. The reality was that the police walked into the trap. The police did exactly what they're expected to do. The day after people smash up the windows, they go back too hard. The same thing happened in Seattle in the WTO. The police first didn't react, and then windows got smashed. Then the police reacted too hard, and the police lost face. And it's all a massive game. So the Toronto Star is one piece of media that's very pro towards the anarchists, and particularly when it comes to violence. But when you look at supporting activist causes and not reporting honestly, I can't help but think of the Vancouver Observer. The Vancouver Observer is one of my other favorite subjects. They were founded by Linda Solomon. Linda Solomon is an American who comes from Tennessee, and she comes from a family who's extremely influential. Her father was the head under Jimmy Carter. He was the head of I can't remember which government. So her father was very well connected in politics. She shows pictures of her with great American politicians, and she moved up to Canada. Her brother was already in Canada, Joe Solomon. Her brother leads Tides Canada. Linda comes up here and starts a blog, basically, with a few writers. She doesn't pay them, they're volunteers, and called the Vancouver Observer. If you read the Vancouver Observer, it's like the Inquirer of the environmental movement, because the stories they're telling are very bent. They're not telling the truth always. They're trying to make things look worse than they are. If you wonder why the Vancouver Observer is so absolutely out of this world in their reporting, is because when Linda arrived in Canada, she published a book, and it said, "Why I Love Vancouver." It was a way of getting the love from the city. And it said, written by a Pulitzer-nominated writer. Linda Solomon was not a Pulitzer nominee. Linda Solomon had someone send $50 in an envelope and a letter that says what she was involved in should be nominated for a Pulitzer. But according to the Pulitzer Foundation, you're not a Pulitzer nominee unless you're one of the 3 finalists. So the Vancouver Observer itself is founded on lies, absolutely. Linda Solomon is also a Hollyhocker, so she spends a lot of time at Hollyhock teaching and working there. Her brother owns a house next to Hollyhock. The mayor of Vancouver owns a house next to Hollyhock. And so the Observer itself is very much embedded, and the stories I see in the Observer are absolutely bent. I'll share one more, which I'm working on right now, which was the BC Civil Liberties Association is making a complaint against CSIS, saying that they spy on innocent activists. The story was broken by the Vancouver Observer. I read it first and I thought it seemed questionable, but I didn't have the evidence. Then someone I know who was very friendly got a copy of the Freedom of Information request that the Observer got for the story they wrote. They sent it to me because my name was on it, because they referenced one of my stories. But the basis of the Observer story, which became what the BC Civil Liberties Association is now pursuing against the government, was that the government is spying on innocent, regular, non-violent protesters. And they listed some of the organizations involved, the Dogwood Foundation and Council of Canadians and a few others. And it sounded innocent on the surface, but when we jump back to the Council of Canadians, to the Quebec Summit of the Americas, the head of the Council of Canadians, Maud Barlow, said smashing windows is an okay thing, sometimes necessary for democracy. But even more important were the other names of organizations on this piece of paper that the Observer presented as being innocent. Known as illegal, which takes us back to Harshawalia and Harjab Grul and the people who were at the front of the line at the G20 and openly promote violence. And another of other very questionable organizations. But when the Observer writes a story on this issue, they say, oh, they're spying on the good people, and don't mention the bad people named underneath. So there's a lot of problems there. CBC. I find it disturbing a lot of people say, oh, all the CBC is this. And the CBC gets it from both sides. I see the people on the right going, CBC is corrupt. I have people on the left going, CBC is corrupt because they're not doing our story enough. But it's not the whole CBC. There are people on the left and right on both. But some reporters in the CBC, I noticed one in Hamilton, he was doing stories on the Line 9 occupation in Westover last summer. His first story was just about Westover occupation. His next story had nothing to do with the Westover occupation, but it said, local activists are worried about the police being too heavy-handed and violent with activists. He didn't even mention the fact that a bunch of anarchists are occupying an explosive pipeline. But he also put Lee Reed in the article and didn't mention that Lee Reed, he was an anarchist rapper who was involved in the group, didn't mention that Lee Reed was part of the protest. So you see these strange propaganda stories of trying to get the people of Hamilton to think that the police could be violent, so that when the police make their arrests, and the anarchists ultimately are very well trained, many of these people, how to make their arrest look like they're being violated. There's something you should look up, both of you guys, if you want to see it. It's Sakura Saunders being arrested. I think if you type Sakura Saunders arrested in YouTube, you'll find it. And it's her in front of the convention center, and the police, okay, you have to leave now, and she wouldn't, so they take her to the police car. And then she starts fighting and dragging her body and screaming like she's being raped. But as part of the training, when you go to Ruckus Society training, they teach you how to get arrested. And they teach you how to make it look as absolutely bad on the police as possible. And they teach you how to do tricks to prepare yourself for when you get arrested. The other story that came out in the Hamilton Spectator was about an indigenous guy who had his headdress taken off, his headdress taken off when he was arrested. How could they do that? That was so awful, to take off his headdress. Someone said this to me recently, a couple weeks ago, which is, the majority of people who join the media, who become journalists, do it for a reason, that they're activists. So when you look at the media, you have to assume almost all the people writing are writing, well, everyone writing is writing from some personal perspective. But many people who joined journalism career did this specifically so that they could create change. So you can call it corruption in journalism, that there are journalists from the CBC who are writing scare stories about the Hamilton police before arrests, or you could call it just part of what their job is, what they feel it is. I guess the question is, how do their media outlets track them, and how do their media outlets ensure that they're not pushing propaganda? That doesn't happen sometimes. CBC is particularly bad for that.
I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this film. I hope this clears a lot of smoke out of the air in the dirty game of radical left-wing politics. We need to start taking a closer look at these foreign organizations that are aiming to destroy our nation's economic and industrial infrastructure.